The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight. Weekdays from 9 p.m.
So a new poll has revealed that Gen Z or Gen Z, I don't know how I'm supposed to say it, and British boys and men are more likely to believe that feminism has done more harm than good when compared with older respondents. So the polling also found that a quarter of UK males aged 16 to 29 believe it's harder to be a man than a woman, with 1 in 5 looking favourably upon controversial influencer Andrew Tate. 37% of them also agree that the phrase toxic masculinity is unhelpful. So, with Gen Z boys increasingly holding this view, has feminism done more harm than good? Let me know your thoughts. Email me, gbviews@gbnews.com, tweet me @gbnews, and make sure you take part in our poll. But I'll bring you those results shortly. Going head-to-head on this tonight are author and commentator Anna May Mangan and YouTuber and social media influencer Pearl Davies. Both of you, thank you very much. Pearl, I'll start with you. Has feminism done more harm than good, especially when it comes to these Gen Z boys?
Yes, it has. Feminism really has turned into a bunch of crybaby women that want to complain that we're not given equal opportunity when really women are given more opportunity than men. And so, yeah, I would say feminism is a hate group and it's a bunch of crybaby women.
Anna, would you like to come back to that? Crybaby women feminism, apparently.
So we've got a right lad with us tonight with Pearl and her opinions, haven't we? How could it possibly do harm? Pearl wouldn't do. I hope you vote. I assume you do. I hope you're not chained to the kitchen sink at home. I'm not sure if you've got a job, so I don't know very much about you, but you're probably, if there's a bloke doing the same thing as you, you're probably earning less than him. So of course feminism is something that it got us the vote in the first place, and it's still doing a power of good. It's just whingy men, and actually I changed that. They're lads, they're not men.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Good afternoon, a very happy Friday to you. It's 3 p.m. and welcome to the Martin Daubney Show on GB News, broadcasting live from the heart of Westminster, all across the UK. Today, George Galloway will be back in the House of Commons next week. Can you, Adam and Evit? We've been asking some of his constituents what they really think about having that controversial man as their MP. And I'll tell you this, they have not held back.
I think it's an absolute disgrace. What's he going to do for Rochdale? I just don't know.
So ashamed of being in Rochdale.
Well, he did say this is for Gaza, didn't he? Next, it's emerged that the government's Rwanda plan could end up costing us £500 million. And remember, we still haven't sent a single solitary migrant to the African country. And I look back on one of the modern era's most defining moments. It's 40 years since the miners' strike started, and the communities where the mines closed are still feeling the same effects. And that's all coming up in your next hour. Welcome to the show. It's always an absolute pleasure and a privilege to have your company. Now, Galloway is back. This was for Gaza. The tectonic plates of politics have shifted. Could this signify a sectarian, divided politics? Yesterday, Rishi Sunak said the mob had taken over the streets. Is the mob about to take over politics? Where might that hit? I've got full in-depth analysis of where that sectarian takeover might happen, what it might look like. Is this an ugly future for British politics? Lessons learned, perhaps, from the Troubles. What will it spell for a divided Britain? So much to talk about. Get in touch, all the usual ways. Do you fear This is the beginning, a new mob rule within Parliament that we've seen on streets. Get in touch, gbviews@gbnews.com. This is your show as much as it is mine. Plus, I want to hear from former coal miners. My dad was a miner. He's watching. Love you, Bob. And I'll be talking about my own life in the pits as a miner's son later. But I want to hear from you. If you miss the mines, you miss those days, you miss the banter, do you miss that cohesion, that wonderful sense of purpose that the pits gave to the British working classes? But first, it's your news headlines with Sam Francis.
Martin, thanks very much. Good afternoon from the GB newsroom, 2 minutes past 3. And we start with some breaking news just coming to us from the Old Bailey in London, that 3 people have today been jailed for life for the murder of a vulnerable woman who was tortured to death. The court heard that 35-year-old Shakira Spencer was found dead in West London in her flat in 2022 after the trio treated her like a slave, beat and starved her. Ashana Studholme, Sean Pendlebury and Lisa Richardson have each been ordered to serve a minimum term of 34 years behind bars. In other news today, Rishi Sunak has said that the campaign in Rochdale was one of the most divisive in recent times after last night's by-election win by George Galloway. The UK's leading Jewish organisation has also described the Workers' Party leader as a conspiracy theorist who, they say, brings division and hate to every place he has ever stood for Parliament. During his career, Galloway has also presented TV programmes for both the Russian and Iranian state broadcasters. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says Galloway will stoke fear and division.
Galloway only won because Labour didn't stand a candidate. I regret that we had to withdraw our candidate and apologise to voters in Rochdale. But I took that decision. It was the right decision. And when I say I've changed the Labour Party, I mean it. Obviously, we will put a first-class candidate, a unifier, before the voters in Rochdale at the general election.
The cost of Rishi Sunak's Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million plus hundreds of thousands more for each migrant sent to the African nation. An investigation by the public spending watchdog found the millions in additional spending includes £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. And there'll also be an extra £20,000 paid to Rwanda for every asylum seeker who's relocated there, with more than £150,000 per person over 5 years to cover ongoing costs. The Prime Minister, though, says the plan is vital to clamp down on illegal migration.
Taxpayers are already forking out millions of pounds a day to house illegal migrants in hotels across the country. That's not right, and that's why I made stopping the boats one of my priorities. I'm pleased that we've made progress. Last year the numbers were down by a third. That never happened before, shows that the plans are working. But in order to fully resolve this issue, we need to have a deterrent. We need to be able to say, if you come here illegally, you won't be able to stay. We can remove you to a safe country. That's why the Rwanda scheme is so important. It's the worthwhile investment, and I'm determined to see it through.
Well, this afternoon we have heard that it's been confirmed the son-in-law of Prince Michael of Kent died from a traumatic head wound. Thomas Kingston was visiting his parents' home in the Cotswolds, where he was later found dead in an outbuilding there by emergency services. That was on the 25th of February. The inquest today at Gloucestershire Coroner's Court heard a gun was recovered from the scene, but police say they are satisfied his death is not suspicious. The government is facing claims of making excuses to delay a ban on so-called LGBT conversion therapy. That's after a backbench proposal failed to make progress in the Commons today. The debate was the third time the law's been considered, but Conservative MP Miriam Cates says there are still irreconcilable differences between its backers and those who oppose it. The bill would mean that unlimited fines could be imposed on offenders who offer or advertise services to change a person's sexual orientation or to change a person to or from being transgender. A man has been jailed for life today for what the judge described as a horrific catalogue of murders. Joshua Jacques killed his girlfriend Samantha Drummonds and 3 members of her family in Bermondsey in south-east London. The court heard today the 29-year-old stabbed his victims in what he claimed was a sacrifice. He admitted manslaughter but denied the murder on the basis that he was mentally unwell at the time. He's been ordered to serve a minimum term of 46 years. Well, another man has been given a rare whole-life order for what a judge described as a ferocious and merciless attack on his former partner and her new boyfriend. 27-year-old Katie Higton and Stephen Harnett, who was 25, were killed by Marcus Osborne. The court heard that he waited for Miss Higton at the house they used to share together before using her phone to lure her new partner to that address. He then continued his violent attack, raping another woman and holding her captive at the home. The cost of a postage stamp is going up again as the Royal Mail raises prices amid a dramatic drop in demand. First-class stamps will rise by 10 pence to £1.35, while second-class stamps are also going up by 10 pence to 85 pence per stamp. A year ago, a first-class stamp cost just 95 pence. The increase comes after warnings by the troubled delivery giant over the impact of lower demand for postage, which it says is pushing up its cost. And if you've not heard it already today, here's a look at the UK's Eurovision entry.
Won't you make me dizzy from your kisses? Will you take my hand and spin me round and round until...
Ollie Alexander has launched his brand new single called Dizzy ahead of this year's song contest due to take place in Sweden in May. The 33-year-old singer has already enjoyed success with his former bandmates in Years and Years, scoring a combined 5 top 10 UK singles and 2 #1 albums. And he hopes that the new single will, he says, transport you somewhere magical. Those are the headlines. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you, Sam. Right, let's get cracking. We've got so much to get stuck into today, but really, there's only one place to start, and it's with this.
Keir Starmer, this is for Gaza.
Yes, of course, Rochdale, that proud town that is seen as the birthplace of the cooperative movement, a proud working-class town, now has an MP who seems to be more bothered about a place more than 2,000 miles away. George Galloway has been a Labour MP, an Independent MP, a Respect Party MP, and now, as leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, he's the country's newest Member of Parliament. Lucky us, eh? Well, let's pick over this now, and I'm joined in our studio by our political correspondent, Olivia. Olivia, thanks for coming in. Always a pleasure. I looked at the reaction to this appointment across various media outlets. Here's what they said. George Galloway's return is a nightmare for Keir Starmer. The Telegraph, The New Statesman. George Galloway's return isn't a nightmare for Labour. The Spectator. George Galloway will be a nuisance for Labour. Where's the truth?
Well, I think that's a really, really interesting question, Martin. How difficult is this for Keir Starmer? There are those who say that actually it's not really a problem for Keir Starmer at all. It would have been hugely embarrassing for Labour had they lost this election, this by-election, to George Galloway, which was always on the cards, let's not forget. Even before the Labour campaign imploded, you know, George Galloway was well up there as one of the favourites to win, but instead Labour had to withdraw their candidate. So there are those who say and you know, respected pollsters say that Sunak can essentially just brush this off. He didn't even have a horse in the race at this, and so yes, he's lost his streak of by-election wins, but it doesn't really matter. It was exceptional circumstances. But there are those who say, and I actually think that there's some truth in that what this by-election proves is that there is now a constituent of people in Britain who are willing to vote in an election, in a by-election, or perhaps two in a general election, on issues not related to what's happening in Britain. George Galloway was proudly campaigning as the candidate for Gaza, essentially, and there are people who will vote for a candidate who is promoting that. Now, is that a problem for Keir Starmer? He has held a pretty robustly pro-Israel line throughout this, throughout the fighting in Gaza. Now, in England, where there isn't really a left-wing party who pro-Gaza voters can default to if they don't like what Keir Starmer's saying, it's not too much of a problem for Keir Starmer. But in Scotland, where the SNP is a very pro-Gaza party, it is possible that Keir Starmer could end up hemorrhaging hemorrhaging votes to the SNP. And we know that Keir Starmer's chances of gaining a proper majority in the next general election are dependent on Scotland.
I want to talk to you about a comment Nigel Farage made. He said, the biggest takeaway for me is that sectarian politics is here to stay in Britain. Following on from what we saw in Parliament Square last week, the mob outside Parliament, is the mob about to move into politics? And in particular, when you look at some of the demographics I've got here, we've got that graphic, we can show it maybe now or later in the show. The top 20 Muslim vote seats in the UK, there is a huge constituency for a party who pitches to them. Some of the seats, 63% Muslim vote. The top 20 are all above 30%. These are mostly Labour seats, but will this now be a kind of coalition of that hard left and the more kind of Muslim vote? And will this be a new movement, or is Galloway simply a one-trick pony?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely a nugget of truth in that. I'm just looking at that list in front of you of the constituencies which have the highest Muslim populations, and I noticed that some of the MPs in those top constituencies were MPs who voted for a ceasefire in Gaza and really pushed Keir Starmer to change his line on this. So it is clear that you know, in some respects, sectarian politics is having an effect on what's going on in Westminster, because there are MPs who are pushing their party to change their line based on their Muslim constituents. On the other hand, I think we should put in a note of caution here. The Rochdale by-election was bizarre, basically. Almost every candidate had some sort of a scandal attached to them. The Labour campaign imploded. Labour were the favourites to win. George Galloway won, but it is very, very difficult to try and sort of extrapolate that into any sort of general election result. So I would say a nugget of truth, but a note of caution necessary too.
Great start to show, Olivia Early. Thank you very much. And now let's crack on and talk to Craig Whitaker. And he's the Conservative MP for the Calder Valley, and that borders onto Rochdale. Welcome to the show, Craig. So, Craig, what's your immediate reaction to this? Galloway himself is saying the tectonic plates have shifted. He said this is for Gaza. Presumably, Craig, you think this is a somewhat darker day for British politics?
Well, to be honest with you, Martin, I think you underestimate the British public at your peril. And we've got to stop saying stuff. You know, politicians from all over the Parliament have got to stop saying that this kind of stuff is divisive, because the reality is a lot of these issues are below the surface. And ignore George Galloway for a minute and have a look at the independent guy who came romping home in second, and he stood on the platform of the things that mattered to people of Rochdale. And so what we see is the two main parties in this country who are complete and utter basket cases at present, is that, you know, there will be a backlash, and there will be a backlash similar to what we've seen in Rochdale.
If you look at the Galloway vote, he got more than the Tories, the Liberal Democrats, Labour and the Reform Party combined. Has something seismic happened there, Craig? The big question is, as Nigel Farage says, is this the beginning of a more sectarian, religiously divided political movement across the UK?
Well, the problem, Martin, I think, is that there's two problems here. I mean, first of all, you've got, I mean, George Galloway, despite what you feel about him personally, is an incredible, formidable politician. Basically, what he's done is picked away at a scab and opened up that wound, because that's what a very large proportion of people in Rochdale felt. So you then have a British government, on the other hand, and we've seen it time and time again with things like Brexit, with, you know, things like climate change, or whatever is the order of the day. Instead of explaining the tremendous things that the British government are actually doing over there in Gaza, Lord Cameron's over there the whole time, going from country to country to get support to try and, you know, get a ceasefire, get aid through. We don't talk about that. We also don't talk about the two British hostages still being held, by the way. But what we do is say, no ceasefire. So there's no explanation behind the reasons why. Okay, there are one or two people that say, yes, this is why we do it. But that needs to be the message. And people, until you know, the major parties start understanding what is important to the British people, we're going to see this time and time again.
OK, but what about the flip side of that coin, Craig? We heard Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, yesterday saying the mob had taken over the streets. They certainly have. I was in Parliament Square last Wednesday when it completely kicked off. People getting pelted. I got pelted with eggs. There was disgusting images on Big Ben. The police did nothing. And is that kind of inactivity not only emboldening the mob to knock on your door at Parliament, but to go places like Rochdale and to say, we can just form a new movement here. No one's going to stop us. And this campaign has been mired in all sorts of allegations of violence, threats of fire bombs, the same old conversation about postal voting. These things keep coming up time and time again. Is that a political nettle that you need to grasp? Because we can't have two-tier policing being allowed to go over into two-tier politics.
No, I totally agree with that. And, you know, politicians, again, are responsible for a lot of that. You saw what happened in Parliament only last week with the Gaza vote. I mean, it was just shambolic. And that was primarily because we have leaders going back some time now that are governing by populist politics. And you can't do that. You have to be very firm, and you have to be very firm about what you stand for. I don't see either the Conservative Party or indeed the Labour Party, you know, particularly the Labour Party. I mean, the guy hasn't got a spine. He's flip-flopping on virtually every policy that comes up. So we've got to be much firmer. We've got to be much more direct with the British public and explain exactly what we are doing. And then let's have the debate. We can't keep flip-flopping the way we're currently going.
OK, thanks for joining us and giving us your input. Craig Whittaker, the Conservative Party MP for Calder Valley, thank you very much for joining us on the show. So, George Galloway accused Sir Keir Starmer of enabling, encouraging and covering what he called the catastrophe in Gaza. And here's what the Labour leader has had to say about that this afternoon.
I think the right thing is to concentrate on the awful situation in Gaza. Tens of thousands of people have been killed. Hostages are still being held for a very long time. And therefore, the right thing is for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to ensure that hostages can get out, humanitarian aid desperately needed can get in, and that we can put our foot in the door for a process, a political process, to a two-state solution that involves the recognition of Palestine.
Now, I stayed up all night to watch GB News' brilliant coverage of the Rochdale by-election. I've got to say, there was one comment from Nigel Farage that really stuck in my mind. It worried me. And he says that last night's result is proof of sectarian voting in Britain.
A very deeply disturbing, worrying vote for British politics and for our future. And as you well know, Tom, for the last few weeks, I've been saying sectarian politics has arrived. People voting purely on religious lines.
See, I've seen that come in before. I went to Batley and Spen during the last by-election when George Galloway stood. I held a free speech rally in Batley Town Square because of the Batley Grammar School teacher who'd been going into hiding. None of the politicians spoke out to defend him. Nobody. They abandoned that guy, and this vacuum has been filled by people like Galloway. But what do the public think? Well, as you know, GB News is the People's Channel. So we've been out and about in Rochdale today to find out what the locals there think of Galloway's win.
He'll only do stuff for Palestine, nothing about the people that live in Rochdale. I think it's an absolute disgrace.
I think it's a really, really good thing for Rochdale and just for the country in general. It's been a long time coming. He's been supporting the right side of history for a long time. There's a lot of people that don't really want to see him win. It's probably the same kind of people that don't want to see Jeremy Corbyn make a difference in the world.
He's won it really on the back of the war in Palestine. What interest he has in Rochdale itself, I have no idea. I think he's just come here to pursue his political career, really. I think all he's going to do when he gets into Parliament is try to disrupt the Labour Party.
So ashamed of being in Rochdale. Yeah, I'm just really disappointed. I mean, the man, he doesn't live here. This is the third political party he's managed to wangle himself into.
Instead of concentrating on what should be happening local with Rochdalians, with the people that live in this area, breathe it, you know, he's got in on the Gaza ticket.
I think he took advantage of the situation in Gaza and the very large Asian population.
And there you go, a divided reaction in a divided town, in a divided Britain that's now breeding a divided politics. And we'll have lots more on that story throughout the show. At 5 o'clock, I'll speak to a man who will be standing as a candidate, an independent candidate in Bethnal Green and Bow at the next election. I think he hopes to be working for George Galloway, and that constituency has got the 9th highest percentage of Muslim voters in the country. And he reckons that George Galloway's win was an inspiration. We'll be talking to him about why he thinks that's the case. And there's plenty of coverage on our website, gbnews.com, and you've helped to make it the fastest growing national news website in the country. So thank you very much. Now it's emerged that the government's Rwanda plan could end up costing us £500 million. And by the way, we still haven't sent a solitary migrant to the African nation. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show, Sunday mornings from 9:30.
I appreciate the story isn't in today's papers, but it has been running all week, and it's this row over the use of nitrogen hypoxia to kill this man who was on death row in Alabama.
Yeah.
And it's been linked back to you, and I wanted to ask you about it because this is intriguing, because you did a television show back in 2015 where you, I believe, tested this method of execution. Just tell me briefly about it, Michael. What happened?
I didn't test this method of execution, and it was a bit longer ago than that. But what I did do was test hypoxia. So I tested various ways in which people are killed in the United States, and asked the question as to whether there was a more humane way of doing it. So I was put into hypoxic situations, for example, into a chamber run by the Netherlands Air Force, which simulated what happens if you're in an aircraft at 30,000 feet and suddenly the windows blow out. And what happened to me was that I was almost instantly rendered incapable. As an experiment, I was trying to play with children's toys, putting triangle shapes into triangle spaces, and I was quickly unable to do that. I was asked, what is 9 minus 5? And I said 5. And then the officer who was with me, the Air Force officer who was wearing an oxygen mask, said to me, Michael, put your mask on or you will die. And I was incapable of putting my own mask on. Now, this suggested that hypoxia was very fast acting.
Yeah.
And that you had... Obviously, I was in no pain or anything like that. I was just completely unaware. By the way, this is why, if you're on an aircraft and it depressurizes, you must put your own mask on first. But of course, I can't go on and draw conclusions.
No.
We did not experiment with nitrogen. But what I can say is it was evident to me that hypoxia renders you incapable almost instantaneously.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. It's 3:26. You're watching or listening to Martin Daubney on GB News. Now, later this hour, I'll discuss the royals as a top historian says they need to come clean about the health issues facing King Charles and the Princess of Wales. Now, catch this. The government's Rwanda plan, which has so far sent precisely 0 migrants to the country, but 3 Home Secretaries fly out there instead, could end up costing us £500 million. That's right, £509 million. Home Secretary James Cleverly was in Rwanda in December to sign a new deportation deal. We'll announce today that if we ever do send 300 migrants out there, the UK will have to give Rwanda another £120 million. Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper says the Rwanda plan is merely a gimmick.
This report reveals the total national scandal around this failing Rwanda scheme that the Conservative government has been trying to hide. It means the cost to the taxpayer over £500 million, and that's just to send less than 1% of people arriving in this country. A cost of about £2 million per person. It's completely shocking. It's just gimmick rather than grit. That money should be used to being spent to secure our borders and to boost our border security instead.
Well, joined now by our Homeland Security editor, Mark White. Mark, welcome to the show. Always a pleasure. Mark, is Rwanda turning into the biggest white elephant project since HS2, or is it something that's worth pursuing?
Well, if it doesn't get off the ground, it certainly will be. And even if it does actually result in people being sent to Rwanda for processing, it may be that it's still not the deterrent that the government believes it will be. But regardless, we don't know as yet until those flights actually leave and people start arriving in Rwanda how successful it might be. But in the interim, of course, we have had this light shone on just how expensive it's going to be by the National Audit Office. The government had told us previously that the upfront costs of the Rwanda plan, the partnership deal with Rwanda, were about 290 million. Now, they did admit that there would be other added millions in the years ahead throughout the lifetime of the scheme, but wouldn't tell us what that was. The National Audit Office have filled in the blanks and come up with a figure of about £500 million, and extrapolating the belief that about 300 or so asylum seekers might be sent to Rwanda. They're suggesting, not the National Audit Office, but others are suggesting that's about £2 million a head. I'm not sure how accurate that actual figure is, because I think you've got to realise that if the scheme is as successful as the government hopes it will be, it's not going to be potentially 300 people, but could be in the thousands. That number is going to change there. You would think that the number or the price per head would drop a bit, but it's still very hefty nonetheless.
But Mark, when you look at these numbers are so big, they're like telephone book numbers, right? But when you look at 500 million and compare it to the price we're spending on asylum hotels, yesterday it came out 15 million a day. It's only actually 39 days worth of hotels. So maybe actually the idea still has credence.
See, I think you make a very good point there, and the government would certainly argue that you need to look at the bigger picture in terms of what they're trying to do, which is the deterrent factor to stop as many people coming across the channel, to reduce the overall burden on the taxpayer of dealing with asylum seekers in this country. They say there is a cost of not doing something, and that cost, they believe, by just a couple of years' time in accommodation alone will cost the UK taxpayer £11 billion a year in housing asylum seekers. So that is very significant. And of course, this figure of about £170,000 per asylum seeker being sent off to Rwanda to be processed, well, that is similar to actually what the cost would be here in the UK of providing the accommodation for a year and also all of the wraparound services. So there's not much difference there. But obviously all the added millions, Martin, are coming in when you've got this Rwanda partnership plan, which is a commitment by the British government to invest in the development and the infrastructure of Rwanda as a country, and also to be able to cope with the asylum seekers.
Superb analysis as ever. Mark White, thanks for joining us on the show. And there's lots more still to come between now and 4 o'clock, and I'll tell you why today is a hugely significant day for people like me and my old man, who was a proud coal miner for 47 years. best of British. But first is your latest news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Martin, thank you very much. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. Rishi Sunak says the campaign in Rochdale was one of the most divisive in recent times after last night's by-election win by George Galloway. The UK's leading Jewish organisation has described the Workers' Party leader as a conspiracy theorist who brings division and hate to every place he's ever stood for Parliament. During his career, Galloway has also presented programmes for both the Russian and Iranian state broadcasters. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says he'll stoke fear and division. The cost of the government's Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million, plus hundreds of thousands more for each migrant sent there. An investigation by the public spending watchdog found the millions in additional spending includes £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. There will also be an extra £20,000 paid to Rwanda for every asylum seeker who's relocated, with more than £150,000 per person to cover ongoing costs. The son-in-law of Prince Michael of Kent died from a traumatic head wound. Thomas Kingston was visiting his parents' home in the Cotswolds, where he was later found dead in an outbuilding by emergency services on the 25th of February. The inquest at Gloucestershire Coroner's Court heard a gun was recovered from the scene, but police say they are satisfied the death is not suspicious. And the cost of a postage stamp is going up as Royal Mail raises prices yet again amid a dramatic drop in demand. First-class stamps will rise by 10 pence to £1.35, while second class are also going up by the same amount to 85 pence per stamp. A year ago, a first-class stamp cost just 95 pence. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts.
For stunning gold and silver coins you'll always value, Rosland Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Here's a quick snapshot of today's markets. The pound will buy you $1.2629 and 1.1666 euros. The price of gold is £1,629 and 97 pence per ounce, and the FTSE 100 is at 7,656 points.
Rosland Gold proudly sponsors the GB News Financial Report.
Thank you, Tatiana. Now, there's always speculation about the royal family, of course, but there's been so many rumours recently that there are now calls for them to come clean about the health of the King and the Princess of Wales. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's News Channel.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
When you listen to Nigel Farage's assessment there, do you feel that maybe this is as good as it was going to get, given that we had the pandemic and it was inevitably always going to be a bit of a mixed bag?
Well, I think it's a bit of a poor excuse from Nigel there that they haven't done it properly. The facts are, Nigel, that it's not worked. It's not going to work. Yes, we will rejoin. I mean, are we better off for it? Are they...
Can I jump in there, Charlie? We're going to rejoin under which government? Because Labour aren't going to do that, unless you don't think...
But I mean, it's going to be unavoidable not to join, because I think it's getting worse and worse for us. I mean, let me just say this. Are the NHS better because we're out of Europe? No, they're not, because they're not employing more staff. Is the building trade better off? No. Is travelling abroad or to the EU or staying in the EU, are we better off? No. Are we better off because foods rise because of the EU? No. Are we better off with imports and export? No, because they're taking longer. The overall result is that we're not better off. The killer point here is 57% of the public would now vote to remain. 33% would leave. Surely that's the telling point.
It depends on the pollster, Charlie, because we were talking to a very good pollster earlier who said there's no enthusiasm for any change in a year. Maybe 10 years, they might be thinking about it.
Belinda de Lucia, let's bring you in. I'm sure you want to react to what Charlie said.
I mean, who would have thought that the UK wanting to run its own affairs and making our politicians more accountable would be so revolutionary? EU Parliament voted a majority to get rid of the vetoes, the last remaining scraps of democracy that the EU had. Now, luckily for EU citizens at the moment, you know, it means a treaty change to actually go forward. But that is the mood. The ever closer union. We have dodged a federalised, globalist, international, power-gobbling, anti-democratic organisation, and that's worth more than a few trade and travel perks for a few wealthy people in this country.
Hear, hear. Belinda de Lucia, Charlie Mullins, great to see you both.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back. It's 3:38. You're watching or listening to Martin Daubney on GB News. Now, we used to lots of rumours about the royals, and of course they have a famous motto: never complain, never explain. But in recent weeks, the rumour mill has gone into overdrive. King Charles has been treated for cancer, but what kind of cancer is being kept a closely guarded secret? Of course, he also had a treatment for an enlarged prostate, which is said to be unrelated to that cancer diagnosis. And of course, the Princess of Wales spent almost 2 weeks in hospital after undergoing major abdominal surgery. And the rumour mill again went into overdrive when the Prince of Wales pulled out of an event on Tuesday at very short notice because of what was called a personal matter. Lots to discuss, and I'm joined now by our royal correspondent, Cameron Walker. Cameron, welcome to the show. Lots of rumours going into overdrive. Shall we start with the princess? Do we know any more? And actually, is it time for the royal family to step up and fill this void because the rumour mill is spinning out of control?
Yeah, Martin, you do speak about this void, and that's a very good description for it. And you said in your introduction there about the late Queen's mantra of never complain, never explain. But in this modern social media age of the 21st century, the palace can't control millions of users around the world offering up their own theory or conspiracy theory about what's happened to the Princess of Wales and creating, let's be frank, quite insensitive memes about her as well, particularly on X. And this void has been created, and what's filling that void is all this unfounded speculation. So it's a really tricky balance for Kensington Palace, because William and Catherine really want their family life and their health matters, clearly, to remain private. The Princess of Wales has a right to private medical information. She is not head of state. She doesn't have to tell us anything if she doesn't want to. But by not speaking out or not clarifying, it does fuel these rumours. But at the moment, Kensington Palace are very much insisting the Princess is doing very well. Sources I've spoken to close to her appear to be very positive. I'm getting the indication that there is absolutely no reason to panic whatsoever. And if you remember back to their statement in January, they said it's incredibly unlikely we're going to see the Princess in public until after Easter, and they have not changed their guidance on that.
OK, and Cameron, we've also had more details on the sad death of Thomas Kingston, of course, Princess Michael's son-in-law. What more do we know now?
Yeah, so the inquest into Thomas Kingston's death, who was 45, opened this afternoon in Gloucestershire, and the inquest heard that he died from a traumatic head injury, and a gun was found near to his body in an outbuilding at his parents' home in the Cotswolds. That's what the inquest heard. There is a lot more details. I'm not sure exactly how long we've got, but just to summarise very quickly, this is clearly just the opening of the inquest. The coroner will give their verdict at a later date, but at the time that Buckingham Palace announced the death of Thomas Kingston earlier this week, his family paid tributes to him, saying that he was an exceptional man who lit up the lives of all who knew him. The King and Queen also sent their most heartfelt thoughts and prayers. Clearly, this is a very distressing time for the family, especially as these details become public.
OK, thank you very much for that update, Cameron Walker. Still to come, I'll look back at a defining moment in this country's proud history as we approach the 40th anniversary of the start of the coal miners' strike. But first, in a GB News series, Innovation Britain, we're looking at the success of the British manufacturing industry around the country.
How many companies do you know that export 65% of what they make? Andrew, what's the export market been like for you?
This year, it's really held up well. The export market has grown, so we've had nice growth on that point, but also we've had good sustained business on a UK basis as well.
Now, obviously, you've been a UK company for over 40 years. So what's it been like through them years?
Everybody's had their ups and downs, and we're no different. But since the 2008 crash, we're right back up to the same sort of figures, if not more. So we've had certainly really good growth over the last certainly 10 years.
So what's this year been like for you?
Good. We've seen some work certainly coming from the defence side of things with the political situation as it stands at the minute. There's been spending on defence this year, and that will certainly continue into the future.
And obviously we've talked about how much you export. So what work do you actually do and what industries do you work in?
It's all basically petrochemical, refinery, nuclear, with Hinkley Point coming on soon. That's been good for us. There's hopefully going to be Sizewell C coming up, and that should be good for us as well.
Now, just last question, obviously, there's a lot of bad news in UK manufacturing, but how are you finding it as a business owner?
It's been difficult. Certain things have given us some challenges, but I think those challenges are the same the world over. I think, generally UK manufacturing is in a fairly good state.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Chris, what is the preferred way in which the police go about their business at the moment? There's these two strands of thinking: evidence-based policing versus bobbies on the beat.
It's very, very difficult. The problem that police have got, basically, is that they're too thinly spread, and it's too much is expected of them. There's a long list, isn't it? Every month we hear police need to do more about this, police need to do more about that, and police do their best. They're overwhelmed with bureaucracy. I mean, when I was a young PC, if I took a shoplifter in, then I'd be in and out within an hour. You take a shoplifter in now, and you're doomed for the rest of your shift for 6 or 7 hours dealing with the bureaucracy. Police want to get back in those communities because community policing is really the core of policing. But such are the demands on their time at the moment, and the bureaucracy, and the fact that they are struggling now to retain experienced officers. People are hemorrhaging out of the police, and new recruits coming in haven't got that experience, and there's a good chance they may not stay anyway. So there's all sorts of problems. And for the Home Secretary to glibly say he wants more done, frankly, clearly shows he's got no understanding of the pressure police are under, and of course the constant criticism that they face across the board. Very rarely do you actually hear of police officers getting praised for acts of bravery or acts of compassion. So there's a problem with morale in the police force, and clearly a problem with the Home Secretary, who needs to get out there and talk to officers on the front line who frankly are struggling. And last night, of course, was a graphic example.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. The time is 3:47. You're watching or listening to Martin Daubney on GB News. Now at 4 o'clock, I'll get more reaction to George Galloway's controversial win in the Rochdale by-election last night. And he said the result was for Gaza. It's not for the people of Rochdale at all, is it then? Now around 30 miles northeast of Rochdale, hundreds of politicians, businessmen and other major figures are meeting in Leeds at the Convention of the North. Of course, the Tories were elected in 2019 on a promise of levelling up. But is there any sign of that actually happening? Well, let's speak now to our political correspondent, Catherine Forster, who is there. Catherine, so it's general election time again, and suddenly politicians care about the North. Last time it was the Northern Powerhouse. Now it's the Convention of the North. What's it all about?
Yes, people in the north of England have heard it all before, haven't they, Martin? Boris Johnson in 2019 stood at the first Convention of the North and promised to level up the North and the rest of the country that had had a raw deal. That's part of the reason he got that 80-seat majority. But plenty of people in the North feel that the government, surprise, surprise, has not kept its promises. Look at HS2, look at Northern Powerhouse Rail. Now, we had Angela Rayner not committing to completing HS2 if Labour came in, and we had Michael Gove making lots of pledges. But, you know, I'm sceptical that the North are really convinced what they hear. And talking to Michael Gove, of course, the Levelling Up Secretary, one thing that did stand out was we are still talking about Boris Johnson, even though he is no longer an MP. Let's take a look at what he had to say when I asked him if they could still win the next election and if Boris Johnson could play a part.
Well, the first thing is, yes, I absolutely believe. I've been involved in campaigns in the past where we started out in the low 20s and we ended up getting 52% of the vote. I was one of the people involved in the Brexit campaign. Campaigns can change people's minds and you can win even when it appears at the start of the campaign you're pretty far behind. And talking of that Brexit campaign, of course, Boris played a big part in that. Boris is a great campaigner. What I would like to see is the whole Conservative family come together in order to ensure that this country doesn't face the nightmare of a Keir Starmer premiership.
Yeah, so a little bit of a dig there, I suspect, at Liz Truss and others who are shouting from the sidelines about what Rishi Sunak could do differently. But clearly, the Conservatives are in a pretty dreadful position in the polls. They need to do something drastic. It does sound like Michael Gove thinks that Boris could really help them. Let's see if it happens. But meanwhile, in the Red Wall, a lot of those voters that voted Conservative last time, it looks like they're not going to be giving that vote next time.
Yeah, Catherine Forster, I too share your cynicism. They all suddenly become fans of the North when the election comes. And can I just say, what about the Midlands? Never seems to get talked about. Catherine Forster, thank you very much at the Convention of the North. Now, to an event that means so much to so many people in Britain, including myself, because 40 years ago today, the National Coal Board announced the closure of Cortonwood Colliery in South Yorkshire. 4 days later, Cortonwood miners walked out on strike. The strike spread rapidly through the coalfields, polarised the entire country and left a legacy in the former mining community that still lingers to this day. Our reporter Anna Riley has this special report.
This was Cortonwood Colliery. Now it's a busy retail park in South Yorkshire. The announcement to close the pit triggered the nationwide miners' strikes, one of the most significant industrial disputes of the 20th century. John Greaves was one of those miners that stopped working.
12 months on strike with no money, yeah, it's hard. We coped, did a bit of part-time work, and we managed. The family split up because some brothers went back to work, and there were all the bad things that could happen.
John was devastated when production stopped at his pit in Goldthorpe. He was in his 40s and had worked there since he left school.
I thought my world had come to an end. I really did. I don't mind admitting I cried on the way home. I couldn't see a future. Not that I was putting myself in any risk, but I just thought, I don't know what I'm going to do. Because I've done a lot, I've done a lot of things while in the pit, but it just seemed alien to me to move out of that environment that I was so comfortable with. I loved the work, the conditions were awful, but I really didn't know anything else. The camaraderie was second to none.
Since the pit closed in Goldthorpe, urban decay has set in, with boarded-up shops and houses lining streets once thriving with trade.
This pit's a shut, it's just gone downhill. There's drugs all over the place. You never see any council workers around here cleaning it up or anything.
We've had a murder the other week. I wouldn't say it's a great place at the minute to be bringing kids up.
When I was younger, everybody knew everybody, we were safe on the street, we got all the shops, there's banks and stuff like that. It's just gone from that to zero.
When the pit's closed, the sort of government never had a backup strategy for, employment in this area. So everybody just went from earning good money, regular money, to nothing.
Filmmakers Rebecca and Dean Sills have produced the award-winning film Regeneration to chronicle South Yorkshire's mining history.
Most of my family were miners, my granddads were miners, and my great-granddads were miners, so it's like a memory film, really.
We've got to remember it because they were an older generation, like our Rebecca don't have a clue what this area were like when there were pits here. It looks totally different. So there's a lot of areas what's run down, but then you've got beautiful areas like where we are today.
40 years on, the miners' strike is remembered by those that lived through it, but the effects of the pit closures remain to this day. Anna Riley, GB News.
Yeah, it's hard not to get moved by that, isn't it? Those pits went, communities were ripped apart, nothing ever replaced them. I'll be talking a lot more about this later in the show, including, is it time to bring back the pits? Now, George Galloway's win in the Rochdale by-election has caused a massive controversy. We'll have the full analysis after this. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's News Channel.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather update with me, Annie, from the Met Office. The rest of the day will remain cold wherever you are. There's a further risk of rain showers and some hill snow. Got low pressure still in charge. That's got cold air wrapped around it as well as these occluded fronts. And that's where the focus for the most persistent rain will continue to be. That area will push into more southern areas of Scotland through this evening and then into northern Scotland later on tonight. So we could see snow falling above around 150 to 200 metres. Further south, it should stay drier for a time this evening, but overnight this more persistent area of rain will push in to the south coast and then up towards the Midlands. That brings a risk of snow to some lower levels by tomorrow morning. So it will be a cold start to the weekend wherever you are, and it will remain quite overcast and wet through much of the day for central areas of England as well as northern areas of England later on by mid-morning. Further south and west, we'll see a mix of sunshine and showers, but those showers bring a risk of heavy downpours showers as well as some hail and further hill snow. So another quite unsettled and cold feeling day to come through tomorrow. Sunday is looking much drier on the whole. There's still a risk of showers, particularly across the south as well as the far north, but many areas should see a much drier day with a greater chance of some sunshine. And it won't feel too bad in the sunshine. We are now into meteorological spring, but there is some further rain to move into the southwest later on Monday. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Anderson's Real World, Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yeah.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system and...
So there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. Yeah. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful lives.
So what sort of offending behaviour are we talking typically for people that's in prison that's actually served in our armed forces?
Primarily, it's violence.
Yeah.
So that is the highest offence that we work with.
Okay.
But of course, the military, as with everybody else, it's the full range of offending behaviour.
OK, so we're in a pub, Jane, Dr. Jane, and I guess for some people, the odd tip of alcohol is good, a bit of fun of a weekend, relax, let your hair down. But for some people, alcohol is not always their best friend, and I guess that plays a part in some of your veterans that end up inside.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, speaking from my own experience, a good 2/3 of the people I work with have some kind of mental health problem or mental health difficulty, struggling to either adapt into civilian life or with some of the traumas they've experienced during service. People might self-medicate with alcohol to manage some of those thoughts and feelings.
Yeah.
Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. The Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
A very good afternoon to you. It's 4 p.m. A happy Friday and welcome to the Martin Daubney Show on GB News, broadcasting live from the heart of Westminster all across the UK. On today's show, George Galloway will be back in the House of Commons next week, and we've been asking some of his constituents what they think about having him as their MP, and it's fair to say they have not held back.
I think it's an absolute disgrace. What's he going to do for Rochdale? I just don't know. So ashamed.
And it's now emerged that the government's Rwanda plan could end up costing us, wait for it, £500 million. And remember, we still haven't sent a single solitary migrant to the African nation. Plus, I look back on one of the modern era's most defining moments. It's 40 years since the miners' strike started today, and the communities where the mines closed are still feeling the after effects. And that's all coming up in your next hour. welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure, as always, to have your company. I want to ask you a question. Is the mob about to take over politics? Rishi Sunak said yesterday the mob has taken over the streets after they knocked on his door at Parliament last week. It's out of control, he said. They need to spend £31 million on security. But what about politics? George Galloway's sensational victory last night. An election fought in Rochdale, a proud northern town. Fought on an issue in Gaza, thousands of miles away, and yet he won. When you look ahead to the electoral map of where the Muslim vote is in Britain, there are 20 or so seats where this could be replicated. Nigel Farage said he thinks we are seeing the emergence of a new sectarian politics divided along lines of religion. Does that concern you? Should we try and do something about that? Or is that just the way things are? Get in touch the usual ways, gbviews@gbnews.com. But now it's time for your latest news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Martin, thank you. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. Rishi Sunak says the campaign in Rochdale was one of the most divisive in recent times after last night's by-election win by George Galloway. The UK's leading Jewish organisation has described the Workers' Party leader as a conspiracy theorist who brings division and hate to every place he's ever stood for Parliament. During his career, Galloway has also presented programmes for both the Russian and Iranian state broadcasters. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says he'll stoke fear and division.
Galloway only won because Labour didn't stand a candidate. I regret that we had to withdraw our candidate and apologise to voters in Rochdale. But I took that decision. It was the right decision. And when I say I've changed the Labour Party, I mean it. Obviously, we will put a first-class candidate, a unifier, before the voters in Rochdale at the general election.
The cost of the government's Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million plus hundreds of thousands more for each migrant sent there. An investigation by the public spending watchdog found the millions in additional spending includes £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. There will also be an extra £20,000 paid to Rwanda for every asylum seeker who's relocated, with more than £150,000 per person to cover ongoing costs. The Prime Minister says the plan is vital to clamping down on illegal migration.
Taxpayers are already forking out millions of pounds a day to house illegal migrants in hotels across the country. That's not right, and that's why I made stopping the boats one of my priorities. I'm pleased that we've made progress. Last year the numbers were down by a third. That never happened before, shows that the plans are working. But in order to fully resolve this issue, we need to have a deterrent. We need to be able to say, if you come here illegally, you won't be able to stay. We can remove you to a safe country. That's why the Rwanda scheme is so important. It's the worthwhile investment, and I'm determined to see it through.
The son-in-law of Prince Michael of Kent died from a traumatic head wound. Thomas Kingston was visiting his parents' home in the Cotswolds, where he was later found dead in an outbuilding by emergency services on the 25th of February. The inquest at Gloucestershire Coroner's Court heard a gun was recovered from the scene, but police say they're satisfied the death is not suspicious. 3 people have been jailed for life for the murder of a vulnerable woman who was tortured to death. The court heard that 35-year-old Shakira Spencer was found dead in West London in 2022 after the trio treated her like a slave before killing her. Ashana Studholm, Sean Pendlebury and Lisa Richardson have each been ordered to serve a minimum term of 34 years. A man has been jailed for life for what the judge described as a horrific catalogue of murders. Joshua Jacks killed his girlfriend Samantha Drummonds and 3 members of her family in Bermondsey in south-east London. The court heard the 29-year-old stabbed his victims in what he claimed was a sacrifice. He admitted manslaughter but denied murder on the basis that he was mentally unwell at the time. He's been ordered to serve a minimum term of 46 years. A man has been given a rare whole-life order for what a judge described as a ferocious and merciless attack on his former partner and her new boyfriend. 27-year-old Katie Higton and Stephen Harnett, who was 25, were killed by Marcus Osborne. The court heard that he waited for Miss Higton at the house they used to share before using her phone to lure her new partner to the address. He then continued his violent attack, raping another woman and holding her captive at the address. In other news, the cost of a postage stamp is going up as Royal Mail raises prices yet again amid a dramatic drop in demand. First-class stamps will rise by 10 pence to £1.35, while second-class are also going up by the same amount to 85 pence per stamp. A year ago, a first-class stamp cost just 95 pence. The increase comes after warnings by the troubled delivery giant over the impact of lower demand for postage, which it says is pushing up costs. And the UK's Eurovision entry has dropped.
Won't you make me dizzy from your kisses? Will you take my hand and spin me round and round until the moment?
Ollie Alexander has launched his brand new single Dizzy ahead of this year's song contest, due to take place in Sweden in May. The 33-year-old singer has already enjoyed success with his former bandmates in Years and Years, scoring a combined 5 top 10 UK singles and 2 #1 albums. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Martin.
Thank you, Tatiana. Now, we've got so much to get stuck into this hour, but there really, of course, is only one place to start, and it's with this.
Keir Starmer, this is for Gaza.
Yes, that's right. Rochdale, that proud town that is seen as the birthplace of the cooperative movement. Now's an MP who seems to be more bothered about a place more than 2,000 miles away. George Galloway has been an MP for the Labour Party, an independent MP, a Respect Party MP, and now as the leader of the Workers' Party of Britain, he's the country's newest Member of Parliament. Lucky us, eh? Well, let's go over this now. I'm joined in the studio by our political correspondent, Olivia Utley. Olivia, welcome back to the studio. A line that leapt out last night in the analysis of this, Nigel Farage said he thinks the takeaway message from this is setting the template now for a sectarian, religiously based electorate. This is the first of many as he saw it. And Olivia, we looked at some of these constituencies earlier. There are a huge number of seats in the UK with 60, 50, 45% Muslim population in the electoral roll, and that's only set to increase. Is this a thing? Is it a problem?
Well, I think there's definitely at least a nugget of truth in what Nigel Farage said. I mean, George Galloway fought this campaign on an unashamedly pro-Gaza footing. He said from the beginning that he would be fighting this election for Gaza, and he received nearly 40% of the vote in Rochdale. And, of course, it's not just Rochdale. Rochdale has a Muslim population of about 30%. Galloway obviously targeted them very clearly, but you have a list, you've just passed me a list of other constituencies which also have huge proportions of Muslims. And those tend to be the constituencies where they're mostly represented by Labour, and mostly the Labour MPs who represent those constituencies have been very actively calling for a ceasefire in the House of Commons. So it does feel, at least to some extent, as though sort of sectarian politics is making its way slowly into Westminster. That said, I think we need to have a bit of a note of caution with this. Rochdale was an extraordinary set of circumstances. There was pretty much scandal around every single candidate. I mean, broad brush, there are a couple of exceptions there. And of course, Labour's campaign imploded, and it felt really as though George Galloway won by default. Also, turnout was very low indeed. So I don't think we can extrapolate the Rochdale result onto the general election as a whole. But I think Nigel Farage is right that it is something that we should be keeping an eye on.
And I wonder if this has happened. It hasn't happened in a vacuum, has it? Like we saw the mob taking over the street, Rishi Sunak saying the mob has taken over. Well, that's because they came knocking on your door. But around the country, people have seen this coming for a long time. I've seen Galloway campaign. He's an extremely impressive campaigner in Batley and Spen. I went there during the last by-election he stood in. I chaired a free speech rally in the town square because of the Batley grammar school teacher who's still in hiding. 3 years, next Friday, 3 years, he's been in hiding. And the politicians there singularly failed to grasp this as an issue, allowing it to be filled with people like Galloway. But the question is it just Galloway as a one-trick pony, or could there be other Galloways in other seats to replicate last night's spectacular victory?
Well, as you say, Martin, Galloway is an extraordinary character. He is, you know, like him or loathe him, and I think quite a lot of people loathe him. He is charismatic in his way. He is a fantastic campaigner. He's a veteran campaigner. He's been an MP before. It's not like there are hundreds of Galloways waiting in the wings ready to exploit these sectarian divides. But, as you say, this is an issue which has been building and building and building, and it does feel as though MPs haven't really got a grip on it. I'm sort of reading between the lines. You can see some frustration from Rishi Sunak at the police for it seems that as though he feels that they don't quite have a grip on it. I mean, I'm putting words into his mouth a bit, but he reminded them of their own powers last week when talking about protests around MPs' houses, and Suella Braverman, then his Home Secretary, essentially suggested to police a few months ago that they could close down protests. So there definitely is some frustration about this building issue among Conservative MPs at least. But it is an issue, it is building, and if it goes much further, then you could see a repeat of what happened in Rochdale last night eventually.
Indeed, and Olivia, the Tory MPs who speak out about it, Lee Anderson, suspended, Suella Braverman got the chop. So there we go. Thank you very much for joining us in the studio. Now, moving swiftly onwards, Reform UK leader Richard Tice claimed that his party's candidate, Simon Danjuk, had received a death threat during the by-election campaign, and here's what Rishi Sunak had to say.
Well, it was very concerning to see the reports of intimidation through the by-election, and by all accounts, one of the most divisive campaigns that we've seen in recent times. You know, I'm pleased that the Conservative Party was the only party to run a really positive campaign focused on local issues with a great local candidate, Paul Ellison, and, you know, well, that's where we are.
So George Galloway accused Sir Keir Starmer of enabling, encouraging and covering what he called the catastrophe in Gaza. Well, here's what the Labour leader had to say this afternoon.
I think the right thing is to concentrate on the awful situation in Gaza. Tens of thousands of people have been killed. Hostages are still being held for a very long time. And therefore the right thing is for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to ensure that hostages can get out, humanitarian aid desperately needed can get in, and that we can put our foot in the door for a process, a political process, to a two-state solution that involves the recognition of Palestine.
Well, I'm joined now by John Rentoul, who's the chief political commentator for The Independent. Welcome to the show, John. So, John, I guess the big question is, you know, was this an isolated incident, Galloway as a one-trick pony, or, as he seemed to suggest himself, of course, he's always his own biggest fan, could this be those tectonic plates shifting? Could this be a new movement? Could this be Labour's worst nightmare?
No, it's a one-off, Martin. No, I mean, as Olivia pointed out there, you know, the circumstances of that by-election were exceptional. I mean, for Labour to disown its own candidate during the campaign produced an unexpected result. I mean, we'll never know what would have happened if Labour had had a respectable candidate who they campaigned for. It would have been quite close between George Galloway and Labour. And you're quite right. There are maybe a few other constituencies around the country where that kind of politics could gain a toehold. George Galloway used to be my MP in Bethnal Green, so I'm familiar with his style of politics. But I think there are very few seats that, in a general election, candidates like George Galloway can win.
When you look at the electoral calculus, John, there are easily 20 seats where Galloway and his party might fancy having a pop across the West Midlands, across Yorkshire. Lots of them, of course, concentrated in London. You mentioned Bethnal Green. We speak to an independent candidate at 5 o'clock who fancies his chances there. Could it have that critical mass? Could it get together? Could there be a sectarian politics emerging, as Nigel Farage said? Or again, is it just a spectacular one-off?
Not in a general election. I think things are different there. I mean, George Galloway, yes, he won in Bethnal Green in 2005 after the Iraq War. But again, that's a one-off. A very special constituency, which I know well, has its own politics, and always has. But there are very few such places in the UK. And talk of 20, 30 seats, Labour being vulnerable in that number of seats, I think is well overblown.
I wonder if things have moved on, though, John. We like to think that politics is a continuum of flopping between Labour and the Conservatives. Of course, it's hard for independents to get hold. The Brexit Party, Reform, they've all struggled to cut through. But we've seen now repeatedly, week after week after week, thousands and thousands and thousands of people turn out. The heart seems to be in this movement in a way which could precipitate a more galvanised political movement, could it not?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there may be thousands of people on the streets of London protesting about Gaza every weekend. But if you look at the national opinion polls, Labour are 20 points ahead and continue to be 20 points ahead. And that means that in most of the country, Labour is heading for a comfortable election victory. There may be one or two seats, as I said, where they could lose to a Galloway type candidate, but this is a blip on the road to a Labour victory.
But if, for example, a party, rather than spreading the margarine fine and fighting everywhere and losing everywhere, we've seen parties do that before, to fight ostensibly a series of by-elections in seats, highly targeted, highly specific messaging to the Muslim community, to the hard left, that's a different proposition to a party just fighting in an ordinary way. But you still remain unconvinced. You still think this is just a blip in the road.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the opinion polling evidence of the attitudes of Muslim voters in Britain, they're mostly concerned with the cost of living, the NHS, and the economy generally, jobs and the rest of it. There's a minority who are very agitated about foreign affairs, but generally, they're going to vote Labour unless they feel taken for granted, and that's something that can happen in specific places, but I think in a general election that's not going to be a significant issue.
OK, well, they certainly felt taken for granted last night, and they certainly voted in a different way. But thanks for your input. John Rentoul is the chief political commentator for The Independent. Thank you very much. Superb input.
My pleasure.
Now, as you know, GB News is the People's Channel, so we've been out and about in Rochdale today to find out what the locals think of Galloway's win.
He'll only do stuff for Palestine, nothing about the people that live in Rochdale. I think it's an absolute disgrace.
I think it's a really, really good thing for Rochdale and just for the country in general. It's been a long time coming. He's been supporting the right side of history for a long time. There's a lot of people that don't really want to see him win. It's probably the same kind of people that don't want to see Jeremy Corbyn make a difference in the world.
He's won it really on the back of the war in Palestine. What interest he has in Rochdale itself, I have no idea. I think he's just come here to pursue his political career, really. I think all he's going to do when he gets into Parliament is try to disrupt the Labour Party.
So ashamed of being in Rochdale. Yeah, I'm just really disappointed. I mean, the man, he doesn't live here. This is the third political party he's managed to wangle himself into.
Instead of concentrating on what should be happening local with Rochdalians, with the people that live in this area, breathe it, he's got in on the Gaza ticket.
I think he took advantage of the situation in Gaza and the very large Asian population.
There you have it, a divided electorate in a divided town, in a divided Britain, now precipitated out into a divided politics. Now, at 5 o'clock, I'll speak to a man who'll be standing as an independent in Bethnal Green and Bow at the next election. And that constituency has got the 9th highest percentage of Muslim voters in the country. And he says that George Galloway's win was an inspiration. And there's plenty of coverage on our website, gbnews.com, and you've helped to make it the fastest growing national news website in the country. So thank you very much. Now, Rishi Sunak has been in Scotland today, and he's made a pitch for votes by talking up the importance of North Sea oil and gas. Let's see how that goes down with the electorate there. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Claire, you want to talk by cars growing by a couple of centimetres a year?
Yeah, well, 1 centimetre every 2 years.
Okay.
It's unrelenting because the people are so fixated on the big SUVs. The sales have gone through the roof, and yet it's James Nix, the analyst for Transport and Environment Campaign, said the author of the report on the trend said, spurred on by sales of the largest SUVs, vehicles are getting wider every year. Now, what does that mean for us? Well, it means that our roads weren't...
Comfortable ride, beautiful engines, smooth. I mean, it's luxury, it's gorgeous.
Well, as I know, I used to have two, but I don't...
You used to have 2 SUVs?
Well, one SUV at a time, but I had 2 brands of them. But I'd no longer drive in London now because I just don't see the point, because of the ULEZ, because of the, you know, you can turn down a thing and get fined.
Parking spaces, whatever.
Yeah, the growth in car size also causes issues for their drivers. The report found that largely luxury SUVs, which are about 2 metres wide, no longer fit in off-street parking.
That's true.
They also leave too little space for passengers to get in and out of the vehicles in typical off-street spaces, and they're about 2.4 metres wide, the report found. And I'll tell you, I was stuck in a bus last night trying to get home, and the buses couldn't move because the streets were too crammed with all of these massive cars either side.
Chelsea tractors.
And it was gridlocked.
Yeah, but maybe they're not the problem. Maybe the buses are the problem.
The buses take people to their place of work and get
I'd
them
like
home.
to know when, because when I go through London, all I see is empty buses.
Well, you're lucky. Every time I'm on one, they're full.
Well, they're obviously only full at rush hour. You see, the thing is, property developers, when they do high-rise car parks, or they build a multiplex cinema and there's a car park attached to it, that's not my fault that I can't fit into their space. It's their fault. So
well, it's all driven by money, isn't it? The more spaces that they have, the more people they can get.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back. 4:25 is the time. You're watching or listening to Martin Daubney on GB News. Now, later this hour, I'll tell you why the cost of the Rwanda bill could be as high as £500 million. You couldn't make it up. They haven't sent a single person to Rwanda yet it's £500 million. Now, Rishi Sunak visited Aberdeen early today, speaking at this Scottish Conservative conference. And despite recent polling, the Prime Minister said he expects the Tories to make gains in Scotland at the next general election. Now, in particular, Sunak outlined his view that North Sea oil and gas remains paramount to Britain's energy security.
And it's only the Scottish Conservatives who are defending our energy security and the thousands of jobs here in the North East that depend on the oil and gas sector. A vote for anyone else is a vote to shut down this industry. Now, what the nationalists, in hock to their Green allies, can't see is that if you destroy the industry that we have here now, you will stop Aberdeen being home to the industries of the future. And as for Labour, well, it says so much about them that they don't want to ban all oil and gas. They just want to ban British oil and gas with their ban on North Sea exploration. It shows so clearly that their values are not our country's values, that they put virtue signalling ahead of our nation's energy security.
Yep. A lot of people will be crying hurrah at that. We've been waiting for a point of difference between the two parties on energy for so long. And don't forget that the only poll boost Rishi Sunak has faced in recent times is when he put back that ridiculous ban on electric cars. Net zero isn't popular. Give the electorate a choice. And now joining me to go over this is our economics and business editor, Liam Halligan, with On the Money. Liam, welcome to the show. Always an absolute pleasure. As you know, this will be music to your ears. Mr. Halligan, you've been talking about this for an eternity. Britain should be energy sovereign. We import £19.6 billion worth of gas every single year, yet we're sat on our own resources. Surely, Liam, at last, this is some common sense.
Very interesting, Martin, that Rishi Sunak is in Scotland. The Conservatives, of course, choosing to hold their spring conference north of the border. There used to be an old joke among party wags at Westminster that there were more pandas in Scotland than there were Tory MPs because Glasgow Zoo had a couple of pandas from China. There are now 7 Tory MPs, 7 of the 59 MPs who sit at Westminster for constituencies in Scotland, separate from the Scottish Parliament, of course. And Labour only have 2 MPs in Scotland. Labour, for much of our life, Martin, has dominated Scottish politics, but not now. But with the SNP very much not falling out of favour, but certainly facing lots of challenges with the change of leadership after Nicola Sturgeon and so on, the Tories hope they could make serious gains in Scotland. Labour also know that unless they win in Scotland, they are not going to win in the country as a whole. They are not going to get the keys to Downing Street. So this is the backdrop to why Rishi Sunak is north of the border. Aberdeen, of course, is the oil and gas capital of Europe. I've reported there for GBNews several times, made films. It's a major part of the Scottish economy, a major part of the British economy, our oil and gas complex. Let's just have a little look. It's got to be time for an on-the-money graphic, Martin. I don't know about you, but I feel that we need one. And here it is. Radio listeners, just bear with me. There are around 300 active North Sea oil and gas fields. They have a natural shelf life, if you like, and over half of currently active fields in the North Sea will cease production by 2030, so just 5 or 6 years' time. The North Sea is a major production site for hydrocarbons, and it still is. It provides 83% of the oil used by the UK. We are, of course, the 5th or 6th biggest economy in the world, and 54% of our gas. And oil and gas combined, anyone who says that oil and gas don't matter just doesn't understand anything about modern economics, frankly, because oil and gas still accounts for 75% of all UK energy. Not 75% of electricity generation. That's very different. It's more like 35 to 40% of electricity generation. But all energy, when you consider transport and other energy uses, it's still overwhelmingly oil and gas. So look, the North Sea oil and gas industry, for a long time, it's already paid 30% corporation tax. The rate for everyone else is 25%. On top of that, for a long time, it's paid another 10% supplementary tax. That's 40%. During the Russia-Ukraine conflict, when energy prices shot up, the Tories put a 25% and then a 35% levy on that, top of that 40% levy. So now oil and gas companies drilling oil and gas in the UK, in the North Sea, they pay a 75% windfall tax. And Labour say that's not enough. We're going to put a proper windfall tax on the North Sea oil and gas industry. Well, I don't know where you go north of 75%. Rishi Sunak has said he doesn't want to say if the windfall tax on oil and gas in the UK is going to be cut, because we've got a budget next week, of course, but Labour are committed to increasing it, and that won't do them any favours in Scotland. It will with some voters, but an awful lot of people in Scotland understand that Aberdeen, the oil and gas industry as a whole, is a major, major part of the prosperity of the UK as a whole, and particularly Scotland north of the border, as does the GMB, the General Municipal and Boilermakers Union, as was the second biggest union in the country. They are really angry at the Labour Party, that the Labour Party wants to increase the windfall tax on oil and gas, not least because hundreds of thousands of their members, the union's members, work in the oil and gas industry. So this is not a straightforward debate. This goes way beyond, you know, the whys and wherefores and the truths and falsehoods of net zero. This is deep party politics. The Tories north of the border in Scotland, they may feel that they've got a chance.
Liam Halligan, you've been superb all week, but you saved your best till last. That was excellent. Thank you, my friend. Have a good one. Great stuff. Now, there's lots more still to come between now and 5 o'clock, and I'll tell you why today is a hugely significant day for people like myself and my dad, who's a proud coal miner for 47 years. But first, it's time for your latest news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Martin, thank you. Your top stories from the GB newsrooms. And breaking news first, we're hearing that the Prime Minister will make a statement at Downing Street just after 5:30 this afternoon. We will, of course, bring you that live here on GB News. Now, the Prime Minister says the campaign in Rochdale was one of the most divisive in recent times after last night's by-election win by George Galloway. The UK's leading Jewish organisation has described the Workers' Party leader as a conspiracy theorist who brings division and hate to every place he's ever stood for Parliament. During his career, Galloway has also presented programmes for the Russian and Iranian state broadcasters. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says he'll stoke fear and division. The cost of the government's Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million plus hundreds of thousands more for each migrant sent there. An investigation by the public spending watchdog found the millions in additional spending includes £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. There will also be an extra £20,000 paid to Rwanda for every asylum seeker who's relocated, with more than £150,000 per person to cover ongoing costs. The son-in-law of Prince Michael of Kent died from a traumatic head wound. Thomas Kingston was visiting his parents' home in the Cotswolds, where he was later found dead in an outbuilding by emergency services on the 25th of February. The inquest at Gloucestershire Coroner's Court had a gun was recovered from the scene, but police say they're satisfied the death isn't suspicious. And the cost of a postage stamp is going up as Royal Mail raises prices yet again amid a dramatic drop in demand. First-class stamps will rise by 10 pence to £1.35, while second-class are also going up by the same amount to 85 pence per stamp. A year ago, a first-class stamp cost just 95 pence. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you, Tatiana. Now, the government's Rwanda plan could end up costing us £500 million. That's right, £500 million, and not a single person has yet been flown to the African nation. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight, weekdays from 9 p.m.
Ken, do you find the Union flag, the Union Jack, divisive?
In some situation, but as Simon quite clearly stated, and I agree with everything that he says in regards that there's situation when people use it for ulterior motive to cause fear, alarm and distress. We saw that with the far right when they came up to saying protecting the Churchill statues and things of that nature. But largely on the large whole, even I wave the St. George's flag on a sporting occasion. And I don't see anything wrong in raising the Union Jack or the St. George's flag so long as the intention is correct. And as he says, Mr. Brockhurst, he served for the country and he should have every right to be proud of what he's done and the way that he wants to display it.
All right, Simon, what do you make of this kind of, I would argue it as like student social media-based politics, where you get these pillocks from the Green Party or whatever saying, oh, it's divisive and I can't believe it. It will be legal in this country to do... Do those people need to get out more? I was on the streets of Stratford earlier on, an incredibly diverse place, speaking to a massive range of people right across different age demographics. I couldn't find a single sausage who said to me that they thought that this guy from the Green Party was right.
He obviously has absolutely no attention from anybody, and this is his way of finding attention. Both Ken and myself, we both agree that nobody should use any symbol of national identity to offend others deliberately, because that's just inflaming a situation. There's so much sensitivity around so many things today, and people do get offended by so much so quickly without any rhyme or reason.
GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Welcome back. It's approaching 4:38 and you're watching or listening to Martin Daubney on GB News. Now, a reminder of that breaking news we brought you a few minutes ago. The Prime Minister will make a statement at Downing Street just after 5:30 p.m. today. What will that be about? The rumour mill is an overdrive, and we will, of course, bring you that live here on GB News. Now, get this. The government's Rwanda plan, which has so far seen precisely 0 migrants sent to the country, but 3 Home Secretaries fly out there instead, well, that could be costing us up to £500 million. Home Secretary James Cleverly was in Rwanda in December to sign a new deportation deal. And it's emerged today that if we ever do send 300 migrants out there, then the UK will have to give Rwanda yet another £120 million. Well, to go over these frankly stratospheric numbers, I'm joined by our Home and Security Editor, Mark White. Mark, welcome to the show. £500 million, no one sent out there. Is this worth pursuing? And these numbers, they just don't add up, do they?
Yeah, I mean, those are the big and important questions. You've got to wonder whether James Cleverly is now kicking himself that he ever took Rishi Sunak up on his very kind offer to give up the trappings of the Foreign Office for a move to the Home Office. As frenetic as things can be at the Foreign Office, it's nothing as compared to the Home Office. It is just relentless, crisis after crisis, and most of it revolving around that situation with the migrant crisis. The latest, of course, being the detail coming through from the National Audit Office on just how much this Rwanda policy will cost the UK taxpayer, £500 million, and much of that is made up by the Rwanda Partnership, which is a deal by the UK and the government in Kigali to ensure that there is investment in Rwanda, in the economy, in its growth and development, and its ability to be able to offer a good life to these asylum seekers. We knew, of course, Martin, that 290 million was the price tag already for that partnership, but there were many other millions of pounds that we would be forking out in the years ahead. The government never told us what that amounted to, but now the National Audit Office does, and it is, you know, an eye-watering figure. I think what the Home Office will say is you've got to look at the bigger picture in terms of what they're trying to do here by this Rwanda policy. If it ever gets off the ground, then it could save many billions of pounds to the UK taxpayer.
Is a key point that you raised there, Mark, because even though £500 million, of course, is a stratospheric amount of money, if you look at the reckoning yesterday, the Labour Party said it's now £15 million every single day on asylum seeker hotels, and that's only actually 39 days worth to get to this £500 million, so maybe it is worth pursuing with.
Well, the government would certainly say that, and they say that there is a cost to doing nothing. And just to hammer home that issue of asylum seeker accommodation, the government themselves are estimating that in 2 years' time, 2026, we could be facing a bill to the UK taxpayer of £11 billion annually for asylum seeker accommodation. So it is a big and a growing crisis. The more we get these boats coming across the English Channel with hundreds of more migrants, they need to be put up in accommodation. They need all the wraparound services. And although many people have been understandably raising an eyebrow or two in hearing the news that we're going to be giving the Rwandan government £170,000 for each asylum seeker that gets sent to Rwanda, £170,000 a year, that is actually not that much different to what we are paying to house them in hotels here. A single asylum seeker to be housed in hotel accommodation and to get all the services of health, education, legal counselling, and eventually, of course, assimilation into the wider economy and settlement into sort of proper housing, all costs a significant amount of money as well.
OK, superb stuff. As ever, thank you, Mark White, for that excellent analysis. As ever, thank you. Now, a man has been jailed for 2 years after OK, we're coming to that shortly, but now we're breaking on that Rishi Sunak statement. Let's get more of the news we broke a few minutes ago, and that is this. Rishi Sunak will now make a statement at Downing Street shortly after 5:30, and the rumour mill is certainly spinning into overdrive. And let's discuss that now with our political correspondent, Olivia Utley. Olivia, dramatic moments. The last time this thing happened, it's a general election being called. What are the rumours out there?
Well, absolutely. It was thought at first that it probably would be a general election. If you take out recess, it's 6 weeks until the 2nd of May, which is when the local elections are. But it now sounds as though it probably isn't going to be an announcement of a general election, which would fit in with the fact that Rishi Sunak has said that the general election will be in the second half of this year. What we understand is that it is likely to be a speech about defending democracy. Looking back at the last few weeks, we have heard some pretty troubling stories about anti-Semitism and also about the threat to MPs. Tobias Ellwood, a Conservative MP, his house was surrounded by pro-Palestine protesters while his wife and children were inside in an intimidatory manner. Mike Freer, the Conservative MP, is now standing down because of a series of incidents over his political career, the most recent of which was his constituency office was set on fire. We also discovered this week that there are 3 female MPs who are having to have bodyguards, a level of security which is normally only given to politicians in high office, the Home Secretary, the Defence Secretary, etc. And, of course, Today, we have George Galloway in Parliament. Rishi Sunak obviously feels very, very strongly about this issue, the safety of MPs, the integrity of our democracy. Those scenes in the House of Commons last week brought shame on Parliament, really. But there were lots of MPs who I spoke to who said MPs are only acting in that way because they are so scared about their own safety and about the threat of, specifically at the moment, Islamic extremism. So it sounds as though that is what Rishi Sunak will be talking about at 5:30, but of course we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, Olivia, thank you very much. Isn't it funny how they go for a speech about, if that's what it's about, a speech about the mob on the streets? When Lee Anderson mentioned that exactly a week ago on this show, he was kicked out the party. Suella Braverman has mentioned this before. She lost her job as a minister over this, and only when the mob go knocking on the door of Parliament and harangue MPs do they seem to finally wake up. Well, look, we look forward to that statement with bated breath. Let's see finally if they're going to clamp down on the mob. I was out there last Wednesday. The police had no interest whatsoever in taking control of the situation. Those images were projected onto Big Ben. They simply stood by, men in balaclavas, disgusting images, disgusting slogans. The police simply did nothing. So let's see if they're going to change their tune. At last, that's at 5:30, of course, we'll have that live. Now, a man has been jailed for 2 years after counter-terror police arrested him for running on an online library of anti-immigration stickers. It's been described as an assault on free speech. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I.
So you want higher taxes?
Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you.
Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months.
That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
The EU rules are trying to choke even that. And I just think, I would join this protest in a heartbeat. And you are right to point out this stuff about them being right-wing. How dare they slate them as right-wing when these are real people whose livelihoods
and
are
remember,
being
a lot of people who work in the farm industry, Malone, get paid very little money.
They get paid.
Agricultural workers are very badly paid.
They get paid nothing, Pierce. And, the profits... I think on Clarkson's Farm, I read somewhere that I saw that when you sell it like a sheep's skin, it's 30 pence or something.
Right.
And you say, what?
Yeah.
And so you wonder how they can manage that. And I think after a year, Clarkson made a handful of pounds.
He made like 90 quid profit or something.
In a whole year working.
But Carol makes a really good point, though, doesn't she, Nikki, about this idea that we go to the supermarkets, we shop there, we eat our food, we don't often give it a thing. And the farmers have become so frustrated by this idea that they are not respected.
Absolutely. I mean, they're running what are effectively small businesses, often family businesses that are being passed down through generations. They also tend to know the land and the animals better than anyone else in those areas. I'm all for green protests, I'm all for climate change activism, but actually... the only way you can do that is gradually. It's exactly what we've seen with Port Talbot. You can't just go in and say, you're not going to do it anymore this way. You've got to do it this way instead.
The Tata Steel thing.
Yes, exactly. You've got to do it this way instead. Lots of farmers are on board with protecting the planet, but they can't do it overnight. You've got to give them time. So they're protesting, they're saying no farmers, no food.
When
well,
you say
can't
you
get any more
support some of
obvious.
these environmental protests, you're not one of these closet supporters of Just Stop Oil, are you?
I'm not a closet supporter. I think I've been quite open about Just Stop Oil.
No.
I don't like all their methods, but I do like the message.
Any of them.
But I do appreciate the message. But sometimes you've got to do difficult things.
What they're asking for now, those protesters, are unrealistic. What these protesters are asking for is not unrealistic.
No.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back. It's 4:49. You're watching or listening to Martin Daubney on GB News. Now, a reminder of the news we broke a short while ago this hour, and that's this. The Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, will make a statement at Downing Street today, just after 5:30 p.m. The rumour mill already in overdrive, and we will, of course, bring you that live here on GB News. Now, a far-right activist has been jailed for 2 years after counter-terror police arrested him for running an online library of anti-immigration stickers. Sam Melia was convicted last month of inciting racial hatred and was also found guilty of encouraging racially aggravated criminal damage. But the jailing has raised freedom of expression concerns, with one free speech activist telling GB News that this is a chilling decision. Well, here to go over this now we're joined by GB News' reporter Charlie Peters. Prison for stickers. What's going on, Charlie?
Well, Sam Melia, 34, has been jailed today for 2 years at Leeds Crown Court following a conviction at the end of January for stirring up racial hatred and racially aggravated criminal damage. Two extremely significant charges that come after he was found to run an online library of stickers, which he called for members of his group, the 100 Hands, to print out and stick around their local communities. Now, the prosecution said that this was designed to spread hate, in particular anti-migration and anti-Semitic hatred. But his defence said that this was an attack on his political opinions. There's been all sorts of controversy, as you'll know, Martin, with free speech issues in recent years, particularly surrounding the Public Order Act and the Communications Act, around the terms grossly offensive and the stirring up clauses in those acts. But some activists are saying that this most recent conviction and now jailing of 2 years is another step towards that authoritarian measure. They do point to the fact that this is, technically a crime without harm. These are stickers, they say. And that's why we've heard from free speech activist Fraser Myers, the deputy editor of Spiked Online, who said that this was an utterly chilling decision. He said that many violent criminals have been punished with far less severity and ferocity than he has for the crime of producing stickers. They said things like they seek conquest, not asylum, and we will be a minority in our homeland by 2066. Some of the supporters of Mr. Melia are now understood to be running a funding campaign to support him and his family while he's away in prison for 2 years. But certainly a very strong reaction from free speech activists over this jailing of 2 years for running what the prosecution say was a racially hateful sticker collection.
Charlie Peters, what do you say to that? I mean, jail for stickers, and yet we see week after week after week on London streets anti-Semitic placards, people calling for jihad, shouting at things like gas the Jews, disgusting images projected onto Big Ben, not a finger lifted. No one ever seems to get their collar out for that. This guy might be a bit of a prat. Not the cleverest thing to do. But 2 years chokey for a bunch of stickers. Charlie Peters, thank you very much for joining us. Excellent as ever. Right, let's get a few emails. You've been sending them in your drafts, and it's all about the Rochdale by-election. Den says this. It's the rise in postal voting that must be addressed with urgency before the general election. In fact, the Reform Party claimed the postal vote in Rochdale leapt from 14,000 to 23,000. We often hear, don't we, in these types of elections, that the postal vote seems to be heavily weighted. Is it time to overhaul that? Totally. Another one saying that is Claire. Claire says, I'd be interested to know how many of the votes for George Galloway were those so-called postal votes. And Anthony adds this. Good afternoon, Martin. This is a terrible result for democracy, with opponents denied the opportunity to put their views forward and allegations of intimidation. I'd have thought for several years that the country is heading towards a civil war. Of course, there were only allegations of intimidation. Galloway has denied them. And Paul again adds this point: you have to stop postal voting. It has been alleged that certain people use double identity sometimes. That's just an allegation, of course. And they use the parents and grandparents of voting privileges, even if they have moved abroad, without telling the authorities. Now then, a reminder of that news we brought you earlier this hour. The Prime Minister will make a statement at Downing Street just after 5:30. We will, of course, bring you that live here on GB News. Will it be about MP security? Will it be something more dramatic? We'll have the full coverage here. I'm Martin Daubney on GB News.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, welcome to your latest GB News weather update with me, Annie, from the Met Office. The rest of the day will remain cold wherever you are. There's a further risk of rain, showers and some hill snow. Got low pressure still in charge. That's got cold air wrapped around it as well as these occluded fronts. And that's where the focus for the most persistent rain will continue to be. That area will push into more southern areas of Scotland through this evening and then into northern Scotland later on tonight. So we could see snow falling above around 150 to 200 metres. Further south, it should stay drier for a time this evening, but overnight this more persistent area of rain will push in to the south coast and then up towards the Midlands. That brings a risk of snow to some lower levels by tomorrow morning. So it will be a cold start to the weekend wherever you are, and it will remain quite overcast and wet through much of the day for central areas of England as well as northern areas of England later on by mid-morning. Further south and west, we'll see a mix of sunshine and showers, but those showers bring a risk of heavy downpours as well as some hail and further hill snow. So another quite unsettled and cold feeling day to come through tomorrow. Sunday is looking much drier on the whole. There's still a risk of showers, particularly across the south as well as the far north, but many areas should see a much drier day with a greater chance of some sunshine. And it won't feel too bad in the sunshine. We are now into meteorological spring, but there is some further rain to move into the southwest later on Monday. Bye-bye.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show, Sunday mornings from 9:30.
Questions to be answered, and there seem to be a significant amount, does once again point its way to a public inquiry into exactly what happened in this case. Starmer's called for that. Would you call for that too?
I certainly think that first of all, there's one thing that's happening now. The NHS have to order an independent inquiry. That's been done. So they've got to look at all the whys and wherefores of what happened with this man. If it appears that we're not getting sufficient depth and breadth to this, then I think having an inquiry with all the powers that brings would be extremely advantageous. What I don't want is some long-winded inquiry that will take years, by which time other people will have been put at risk and maybe other lives have lost. We know what the problems are here, Camilla. Law's been passed on this. This is all about making sure on the ground we implement the highest degree of monitoring in order to ensure the safety of the public.
Has care in the community failed? I mean, it seems oxymoronic to say that it's care in the community in this case. We know that the number of psychiatric care beds has been slashed from 52,000 back in 2001 to 24,000 now. I've anecdotally, because I wrote my column about this in The Telegraph yesterday, received quite a lot of correspondence from people saying the situation with care in the community is dire. People aren't being adequately monitored. Was it a mistake to close down all of those mental institutions?
I don't think we should go back to those days when we had those appalling institutions where we just lock people away and forget about them, and not just mental health people, but autistic people and disabled people. Horrific way to treat individuals, and you know I campaign on that a lot.
I know.
However, I think if we move into a more community-based approach, which can be really good for many, many people who are on the spectrum and on that scale of mental health, we have to remember there will be a small but significant number who will continue to pose a danger.
Okay.
And that's why monitoring is so important.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, it's 5 p.m. A very happy Friday afternoon to you. Welcome to the Martin Daubney Show on GB News, broadcasting live from the heart of Westminster, all across the UK. Now today, the Prime Minister will make a statement at Downing Street just after 5:30 p.m. We will, of course, bring you that live here on GB News. Lots of speculation about what it's going to contain. Will it be about the MP security risk? Will it be something more dramatic, like a call for a general election, perhaps? We'll have that full live story here just after 5:30 p.m. And of course, I want to hear from you. Email me at your views, gbviews@gbnews.com. Get in touch on that. Plus that shocking by-election victory for George Galloway last night. Will sectarian politics divide the country? Will Rishi Sunak finally address what he said yesterday is the mob taking over on British streets before it takes over in British politics? That's coming up. But first, it's time for your latest news headlines with Tatiana Sanchez.
Martin, thank you and good afternoon. 1 minute past 5. These are your top stories from the GB newsroom. And as you've just been hearing just now, the Prime Minister is due to make a statement at Downing Street just after 5:30 this afternoon. That's around half an hour's time. We will, of course, bring you that live here on GB News. Well, the Prime Minister says the campaign in Rochdale was one of the most divisive in recent times after last night's by-election win by George Galloway. The UK's leading Jewish organisation has described the Workers' Party leader as a conspiracy theorist who brings division and hate to every place he's ever stood for Parliament. During his career, Galloway has also presented programmes for both the Russian and Iranian state broadcasters. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says he'll stoke fear and division.
Galloway only won because Labour didn't stand a candidate. I regret that we had to withdraw our candidate and apologise to voters in Rochdale. But I took that decision. It was the right decision. And when I say I've changed the Labour Party, I mean it. Obviously, we will put a first-class candidate, a unifier, before the voters in Rochdale at the general election.
A 42-year-old woman who was arrested on suspicion of murdering 3 siblings in Bristol has been detained under the Mental Health Act. It comes after the bodies of Faris Bash, aged 7, Juri Bash, who was 3, and 9-month-old Mohammed Bash were found in sea mills on the 18th of February. The woman's receiving treatment in hospital for physical injuries, which are not life-threatening. Now, the cost of the government's Rwanda scheme could soar to £500 million plus hundreds of thousands more for each migrant sent there. An investigation by the public spending watchdog found the millions in additional spending includes £11,000 for each migrant's plane ticket. There will also be an extra £20,000 paid to Rwanda for every asylum seeker who's relocated, with more than £150,000 per person to cover ongoing costs. The Prime Minister says the plan is vital to clamping down on illegal migration.
Taxpayers are already forking out millions of pounds a day to house illegal migrants in hotels across the country. That's not right, and that's why I made stopping the boats one of my priorities. I'm pleased that we've made progress. Last year the numbers were down by a third. Never happened before. Shows that the plans are working. But in order to fully resolve this issue, we need to have a deterrent. We need to be able to say, if you come here illegally, you won't be able to stay. We can remove you to a safe country. That's why the Rwanda scheme is so important. It's the worthwhile investment, and I'm determined to see it through.
The son-in-law of Prince Michael of Kent died from a traumatic head wound. That's according to an inquest. Thomas Kingston was visiting his parents' home in the Cotswolds, where he was later found dead in an outbuilding by emergency services on the 25th of February. Gloucestershire Coroner's Court heard that a gun was recovered from the scene, but police say they're satisfied the death isn't suspicious. 3 people have been jailed for life for the murder of a vulnerable woman who was tortured to death. The court heard that 35-year-old Shakira Spencer was found dead in West London in 2022 after the trio treated her like a slave before killing her. Ashana Studholm, Sean Pendlebury and Lisa Richardson have each been ordered to serve a minimum term of 34 years. Now, the cost of a postage stamp is going up as Royal Mail raises prices yet again amid a dramatic drop in demand. First-class stamps will rise by 10p to £1.35, while second-class are also going up by the same amount to 85p per stamp. A year ago, a first-class stamp cost just 95p. The increase comes after warnings by the travel delivery giant over the impact of lower demand for postage, which it says is pushing up costs. And the UK's Eurovision entry has dropped.
Won't you make me dizzy from your kisses? Will you take my hand and spin me round and round until the moment?
Ollie Alexander has launched his brand new single Dizzy ahead of this year's song contest due to take place in Sweden in May. The 33-year-old singer has already enjoyed success with his former bandmates in years and years, scoring a combined 5 top 10 UK singles and 2 #1 albums. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen, or you can go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now it's back to Martin.
Thank you, Tatiana. Now we start with that big breaking news story. And Rishi Sunak will make a statement at Downing Street shortly after 5:30 today, live outside Downing Street. And of course, let's now speak to our political correspondent, Olivia Utley, who's in the studio. Olivia, huge speculation about what this may be. What do we know?
Well, we understand it's not going to be a general election. That's what the original thought was. Unsurprisingly, calling a press conference at 20 to 6 on a Friday evening is pretty unusual. It took everyone by surprise. And, of course, takes 6 weeks between calling a general election and holding that election. And it is 6 weeks until the 2nd of May, which is when the local elections are, if you take out recess. So that was the first big rumour. But no, what it's going to be, well, what it sounds like it's going to be, is a speech about protecting democracy. Obviously, the last few weeks have been very, very toxic in British politics. We've had news that Tobias Ellwood, a Conservative MP, his house was surrounded by pro-Palestinian protesters aiming to intimidate him and his wife and children who were in the house at the time. We've had news that Mike Freer, another Conservative MP, is standing down after a series of close, near misses, essentially, the last of which was his constituency office burning down. Then we had news that 3 female MPs in Parliament from different parties are now being given close protection, something that's normally only offered to the Home Secretary and Defence Secretary because of the threat of extremism in Parliament. Then, of course, most recently, we had those awful scenes in Parliament where, difficult to get exactly to the bottom of what happened, but what it sounds like is Keir Starmer went to Lindsay Hoyle and said, please can you call our motion in Parliament today on a Gaza ceasefire, because if you you don't, then some of my MPs are under risk of attack by their constituents or neighbouring constituents for not voting for a ceasefire in Gaza. Hoyle gave in to Keir Starmer, broke all precedent to give in to Keir Starmer, presumably because he believed that that threat was very real. Now we've had Rishi Sunak saying that the mobs are taking over the street, and of course today, first day of George Galloway, the well-known, infamous, really, MP, anti-Semite, a man who is known for dividing people wherever he stands. So it sounds like Rishi Sunak is keen to make the speech to show that he cares very deeply about the threat of sort of sectarianism in British politics and the threat of safety to parliamentarians. He wants to make sure that democracy is protected. Let's hope we'll hear a little more detail about how he plans to do that.
Well, Olivia, a lot of people will be saying, what took you so long? And a lot of people will also be saying, you only seem to take action when this trouble came to your own door. Not to undervalue that, but what I'm saying is this. This has been totally out of control now since October the 7th onwards. Massive spikes in anti-Semitism, disgusting reports of people too afraid to walk the streets, Jewish children too afraid to display the insignia of their Jewish schools on their blazers, people saying they feel afraid to walk certain parts of our major cities, people leaving the country, MPs, to be fair, of all the major parties, harangued. Sir Keir Starmer was harangued in Scotland off a train, Angela Rayner while campaigning, Rachel Reeves, Annalise Dodds. They've all had hassle, of course, Mike Freer, and now it's got to the point where they feel they have to take action. But my question to you, Olivia, is how much of them sitting on their hands and the cat having their tongues for so long has made this situation get to this inflamed point where they have now to take action?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that Rishi Sunak and the government will probably argue that they've been trying. I mean, Rishi Sunak reminded police of their powers last week to cut down on intimidatory or potentially violent protests.
But they haven't been doing it.
When she was in power as well, reminded the Met Commissioner that he did have the power to stop those marches going ahead, those pro-Palestinian marches going ahead at the weekend. There is an argument that it's the Met Police rather than the government who have sort of allowed these marches, if you like, to perhaps get a bit out of hand. That might be what the government would say behind closed doors. I mean, as you say, I mean, what is Rishi Sunak going to do? It's all very well sort of hand-wringing about this. We've seen that already. He's already said there's a danger of the mob controlling the streets. He can't really just stand in front of Downing Street and say that again. He's got to match his words with some sort of action. Presumably, that's what he's going to do, because calling journalists to Downing Street at 20 to 6 on a Friday for no reason at all is not likely to get him good headlines in the papers tomorrow.
OK, Olivia, at least stick with us, but I'm crossing now live to Downing Street, where we're joined by GBNews' political editor, Chris Hope. Chris, dramatic stuff late on a Friday afternoon. We've been saying, Chris, on this show for well over a week now, the mob seems to be taking control. Do you think this is what Rishi Sunak is finally going to address?
I think the PM clearly, by his remarks earlier, Martin and Hi Liv, he's still clearly concerned about the by-election overnight where I was in Rochdale, and I've just charged from the Wetherspoons in Rochdale to number 10 Downing Street. That's the life of a journalist nowadays for GB News, but it's good to be here. It's about to pour with rain very heavily. He clearly is... He couldn't act until the people of Rochdale have spoken. They've elected George Galloway, who, of course, has got issues for many people in the Jewish community, and we'll see that played out next week. He clearly thinks now there's a line in the sand to be drawn on the issue of extremism. We saw him set out £31 million earlier this week and a plan to keep MPs safe and prospective candidates. We're at the beginning of a long election cycle running into probably the November election. We don't expect him to call the election right now. I think he wants to set the tone right and make clear that any kind of extremism, any kind of bullying, intimidation of people running for office for public life will not be tolerated. I think that's the direction of travel we're going to see shortly, but I'm not sure yet. We're getting no indication from Downing Street, but judging by the mood music coming out from what he said earlier in Scotland on his visit there to the Tory conference, that's probably where it's going.
Is it astonishing, though, Chris, how literally a week ago to the minute when we were speaking with Lee Anderson, in his usual forthright manner, shall we say, he spoke out about this precise issue, and yet for doing that, he had the whip suspended from him, Chris. And previous to that, Suella Braverman spoke about this, and she was punished for being too forthright. And maybe these people were right. Maybe this did need to be spoken about all along. And the situation we were hearing about in Rochdale last night of intimidation, of bullying at polling stations, and of course the eternal conversation, Chris, about postal votes. Something has to be done.
Yeah, and we're not sure what it is yet. Again, we don't know what he's going to announce at 5:45 outside 10 Downing Street. Stay tuned to GB News. You'll see every cough and spit from the Prime Minister makes, and we'll be analysing it for you through the early evening. We don't know what he's going to say yet, but it seems to me a line was crossed last week, wasn't it, when the Speaker stepped in to allow Labour MPs to vote on its policy, its party policy on Gaza, to avoid to recognise the pressure they're under locally and not make it any worse for them. That was the moment the government said, well, enough is enough. We're going to start. We're giving bodyguards to people under threat. You'll have a 48 hours notice of any demonstration, any attempt to go near your home will be seen as intimidation in the law and punishable by the police and prosecuted through the courts. Lots of measures, I think, but last night's election almost caps what has been a very difficult time for our MPs over the past 3 or 4 weeks, and I wonder whether that's where the PM will be going when he speaks to us shortly.
But surely, are they finally going to get their head out of the sand and address the elephant in the room? Chris, all of these events are linked to one thing. Since October the 7th, the Islamism in the country is getting to be a serious issue. And as I said again, Chris, every time it's brought up by somebody, they seem to be chastised or they seem to be smacked down. Can we finally see the Prime Minister grasping the nettle and having the guts and the courage to face this down?
There's a balance all the time in politics and in policing. You've got to allow a degree of peaceful, lawful protest, Martin. It's the people around the edges that we've seen in those weekly demonstrations on the streets of London, which have caused such upset. He has been calling that out, and the truth is there is law out there that isn't being applied by the police. You saw for yourself, Martin, last Wednesday when the police were not intervening to stop that hateful language displayed on the Elizabeth Tower housing Big Ben about Israel and the Jewish community. The laws are out there. We have got a lot of laws that are not being enforced. The law stopping people wearing masks in marches. It may be a kind of enough is enough speech from the Prime Minister. Again, no questions. He'll be speaking from the steps, but this is very rare. I can't think when he last did this. I've been racking my brains probably about 2 years ago. So we don't think it's anything. Well, we think it's going to be dramatic because it is. It's Friday night before a budget next week. But stay tuned.
But Chris, I know we're speculating here, but we know the direction of travel, what this is going to be about. Words aren't enough, are they? It's OK to spend £31 million on MP security. When we talked about it a couple of days ago, Chris, in the studio, as you know, we put this to the GB News viewers. We had hundreds and hundreds, about 600 emails within an hour. People saying this is the situation that's been created by inactivity. It's been a situation created by standing off, by soft-soaping, by failing to grasp the nettle, by not having the courage of the convictions to face it down. And into that vacuum, we've had chaos. Chaos fills vacuums. It's the law of physics. What can be done? I mean, words are one thing. They have, as you say, Chris, they've got the bills. But what about the will to enforce it?
I think that's the frustration. We had the PM calling in regional police chiefs from England and Wales 2 nights ago when he laid down the law. He issued that new protocol we discussed on the show yesterday, making clear what is expected of police. You've seen money set aside, the right to bodyguards, fair warning of any protest. He's doing all he can short of actually taking over policing. Now, Lee Anderson said on air last Friday, why can't the government step in and do the policing themselves? Well, we don't do that in this country, do we? We have laws are made by MPs and government and police enforce the laws. I think this is a change in tone from the Prime Minister. Clearly he's been upset by what he saw overnight in Rochdale. It's now starting to affect people, maybe even people's voting behaviour, though we don't know that for sure because, of course, Labour withdrew from that contest overnight, didn't they, and didn't support their candidate after the ballot papers were printed. So it's hard to judge, but certainly there's a lot of concern behind me that what is changing, the democratic fabric of this place that elects our MPs, that got him into office, is under threat, and I wonder whether that's where the PM's going shortly.
And Chris, on the matter of Rochdale, you were on the ground, you were up there, you were in the thick of it. What kind of rumours, allegations and stories were you hearing about the febrile, ugly nature of this particular by-election?
Well, we heard from the candidates alone, from Simon Janchuk saying that he had threats, others, lots of mud being thrown around. It was, you know, we are where we are. We have got an MP for Rochdale, George Galloway. He is due to take his seat next week in Parliament. I wonder whether this statement is looking into next week almost, because George Galloway, where he sits, who accompanies him, lots of Jewish MPs will be upset and worried about him being on those green benches. The board of British deputies has said that MPs should turn their backs to him, not talk to him because of his previous remarks about Israel and the Jewish community. So I think we are approaching a very difficult time in Parliament, and maybe this is the PM drawing a line saying enough is enough. It's time that we re-embrace with those British values of tolerance and decency, recognising that, of course, the Gaza conflict is extremely divisive for so many communities, but the British government is doing all it can to get those hostages freed and ensure that peace starts to prevail over there.
OK, Chris Hope, live from Downing Street. Thank you very much. And, of course, we'll let you go now to go and get a position on the front row, and we'll be coming back to you for reaction, of course, after that statement. That was Chris Hope, live at Downing Street. Back to the studio, where I'm still joined by Olivia Utley. So it seems now the direction of travel is really, this is going to be about that security issue, the breakdown of democracy, and Chris intimating there, this looking ahead. George Galloway will be sat in the House of Commons. He'll be sat with Jewish members of Parliament who will be absolutely horrified that this is happening. But it is. The people have spoken in this extraordinary by-election, Olivia, and all of this just starts to send out the message that British politics has become so incredibly toxic.
It does feel as though British politics has become very toxic, and really quite suddenly. George Galloway's election wasn't predicted when this by-election was called. It was thought that Labour would easily win. Of course, Labour's campaign ended up imploding, and the candidate that was supposed to stand for Labour had to stand as an independent. Of course, the tension has been building pretty much ever since October the 7th, when those pro-Palestine marches began in London and then spread across the rest of the UK. And we've heard some awful stories about MPs being intimidated. Speaker Hoyle is clearly taking the threat to MPs very, very seriously. It'll be fascinating to see what action Rishi Sunak is going to put behind his words. It's all very well saying that the mobs are ruling the streets, but his party has been in power for 13 years. What is he planning to do about it? Obviously, it's a bad moment for British politics to get very toxic. We are in a general election year. Already we have a particularly sort of open, representative democracy. Our MPs are on the streets of England and Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. They have their surgeries on Fridays where anyone from their constituency can come up to them in person and talk to them about any issue. We've seen 2 MPs murdered in the past 8 years. And in a general election year, MPs are more visible than ever. The idea that there are people who wish them harm, who could just come up to them in the street, is very alarming indeed, and something that everyone at the top of politics is clearly taking very, very seriously.
Yeah, and yet we covered a story a moment ago about a far-right activist who's been jailed for racist stickers. And yet we've seen, since October the 7th, a spectacular failure, I believe, from the Metropolitan Police to clamp down on these these weekly marches, we've seen disgusting placards, disgusting images projected onto Big Ben. The police literally stood by and did nothing. I went into that crowd last Wednesday, Olivia, and I pointed out to the coppers there's the projector. There it is. Go and take it down. What are you going to do? And they simply stood by and did nothing. They had no interest whatsoever. We've seen protesters clambering all over war memorials, causing deep upset and offence to the British electorate and the public watching. We've seen no real appetite to protect our heritage, our statues, what's sacred. And then they only seem to have reacted when the mob formed outside Parliament. A lot of people will be thinking, why weren't these statements given when the Batley Grammar School teacher was sent into hiding 3 years ago? Next Friday, that's going to be 3 years. Nobody stuck up for that teacher. The police have turned a blind eye. The MP turned a blind eye. You know, the school union turned a blind eye. Grooming gangs. All this stuff has been going on for years. But look, finally, we may be at a point. The big question is, what kind of powers can Rishi Sunak have? We heard there from Chris Hope, regional police and crime commissioners, police chiefs brought to Downing Street. Maybe they'll go back to the provinces and do things differently. But the big question is London. The Metropolitan Police and the police and crime commissioner in London is Sadiq Khan. And we seem to have this standoff. Who's in control? Who's going to take action? And I guess today, will the Prime Minister show that he's in control?
Well, I think one issue that the government would probably point to is that actually the police have a lot of the powers that you're talking about. The police do have the power to shut down these pro-Palestine marches if they are thought to be too intimidatory, if they're thought to be slipping into sort of hate speech, etc. But more often than not, they don't seem to use them. And this has been an issue, that tension between the government and particularly the Metropolitan Police for quite a long time now. Suella Braverman has talked about, one rule when she was Home Secretary, talked about one rule for them, another rule for the rest of us. And, you can see if you head into London on a protest day, the different ways that different groups of protesters are treated. I remember being in Whitehall watching a Just Stop Oil campaign. They were crowding the streets. They were stopping cars passing through one of the busiest areas of London. They were lying down in the middle of the road, slow walking, etc., all of which are now illegal under a new government law, a law that the government brought in to stop exactly that. But what the police were doing was picking them up, taking them over to the side of the pavement, lying them on the street and putting pillows under their heads, something which, there are plenty of MPs thought that was not a particularly appropriate way for the Metropolitan Police to behave. So I think what the government might say to your argument is that the laws are in place. The problem, perhaps, is that the police aren't particularly willing to use the powers that they've already got, in which case, is there much point in the government trying to create a whole load of new powers and layering laws on top of laws? The Met Police, of course, would say, and this is absolutely true, quite right, that we do have in this country a right to protest. Their job is to make sure that those protests are peaceful. They would say that they've done everything they can, and actually, if you point to actual violent incidents over those pro-Palestinian marches, it's pretty difficult. But I think that's the real problem for the government. Is there any point bringing in more laws? Is a lack of laws really the problem here, or is it a lack of willingness to enforce those laws?
Excellent point, Olivia. Lee, as ever, that's what we've been saying for weeks and weeks and weeks on here. They've got the bill, but have they got the will to enforce it, or are they just going to keep standing off? Well, I'm joined now by Nigel Nelson, who joins us to give us his take. Nigel, welcome to the show. So a dramatic end-of-week moment. These aren't done lightly. There's normally big news coming out of them. It seems, Nigel, that all the direction of travel, the information we're hearing, this will be a major announcement about political toxicity and security. What's your take?
Well, it rather depends on what the Prime Minister is going to announce. And it's obviously taken us all by surprise. The danger, obviously, is if the idea is to ban protests, that can actually drive it underground, and then you get violence taking over. Now, what we don't know is what kind of intelligence the Prime Minister has received. He may give us some indication of that when he appears outside Downing Street. But if he has received intelligence that there's something more serious going on, then, of course, as Prime Minister, it's his duty to act.
And in terms of the greater backdrop, Nigel, the kind of breakdown for respect for law and order, particularly since October the 7th, we've seen just the mob getting away with it, just clambering on war memorials, pelting people with eggs, as happened to me, those revolting placards, beaming messages onto Big Ben. Like I say, I was in there saying to the police, there's a projector, take it down. These nations are shaming our country. They are being beamed around the world. It sends out a clear message that Jewish people are not welcome on British streets. We've seen a huge boom in anti-Semitic hate crimes every single time these marches happen, Nigel, and yet the police have simply stood by. But now they're acting. Are they only acting, do you think, Nigel, because this ended up being outside their front door?
Well, I mean, that may have something to do with it. I think it's more a question of what kind of danger the people behind these protests are actually pose. Now, you were obviously in the thick of it last Wednesday, and you saw the police not actually taking action, Martin. I mean, usually the only reason that you don't do that is if you risk making things worse. The police are operationally independent, as we know. What they've got to balance is whether or not by arresting somebody, they will then increase the risk to public safety. So as you and I will both know from our reporting days, when you go out and cover a demonstration, it can, with just one small incident, suddenly erupt into a riot. And obviously then lives are at risk. And these things start as quickly as a pub brawl. Now, you'll know whether or not that was actually a risk last Wednesday when you got pelted by eggs. But quite clearly, if it wasn't a risk, the police should have acted.
Yeah, and that's the problem, isn't it? I mean, we've had this conversation now, Nigel, every single week since October 7th. There is a very, very real feeling that we have two-tiered policing. At Armistice Day, I was also there for the 2-minute silence, and it got very, very fruity, shall we say, around there later on. The police had no problem whatsoever in steaming into people there from the veteran side, from the patriot side, and yet later on, when the pro-Palestinian protesters came in, they just formed a barrier and did nothing. When it kicks off at Trafalgar Square, they simply watched. There seems to be a different type of policing, and that is, it's a more confrontational type if you're a counter-protester, and it's a stand back and watch and surveillance base and then act afterwards. But Nigel, it just leaves a taste in the mouth. We have two-tier policing, and that creates a vacuum, and it's self-perpetuating.
Well, again, it depends on what is actually happening on the ground as far as the police are concerned. So the one thing that they do try and do is that they try and contain protests. They try and contain it if any kind of violence breaks out. And again, I mean, a police chief must be free to make that decision very quickly on the ground as he or she sees fit. So my feeling about the Palestinian demonstrations is, yes, there has been some law breaking. There have been some anti-Semitic slogans where the police have actually moved in and dealt with that. But again, they must actually judge each situation on its merits and make sure that it doesn't result in something worse than what you're actually facing. And in fairness, for the most part, those Palestinian protests have been peaceful. I know they all, not all of them have. I know that we've had fireworks being let off and things like that. But as I say, that it's down to the police on that moment to decide what is best. They may not be getting the balance right.
Yeah, I mean, we saw today, Nigel, a man, an idiot, a prat, who's been jailed for putting around racist stickers. He's been jailed for 2 years for distributing stickers. And yet we've seen people in those marches in London dressed as Hamas terrorists. We've seen calls for jihad. We've seen Hamas wear, outfits being worn. We've seen people calling for the gassing of Jews. We've seen repeated disgusting crimes. And we saw those young women with those paraglider images on their clothing. They were spared jail. They were spared jail by a judge, it turns out, who'd liked a post showing his clear political bias towards the cause. And so there is a very, very real feeling, Nigel, that we don't have police that are acting without fear or favour. They seem to be acting with favour towards one side and very much acting in fear of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of those incidents you've mentioned, that they clearly warranted arrest and prosecution. Any kind of support for Hamas or any other terrorist organisation is illegal, and that's the point where the police must intervene. I think in other areas it becomes a bit more of a problem. From the river to the sea slogan isn't actually anti-Semitic in itself. It depends on the interpretation you put on that, and the way the police have tackled that is to say, if it's chanted on a protest, that's one thing. If it's chanted outside a synagogue or a Jewish school, that then becomes anti-Semitism, and they will move in. So it depends on circumstances, context, and interpretation.
OK, so for example, last Wednesday, from the river to the sea, a phrase which, by the way, a lot of people do take to mean calling for the sweeping aside of the entire Jewish nation, for the removal of Jewish people from Israel, for Israel to be swept literally into the sea. That's one interpretation. And that being beamed onto Big Ben, which in itself is an offence. Parliament isn't a billboard. You need a licence to do that. You need permission. It's a clear breach of the rules. And yet, as I keep saying, nothing was done. It was simply allowed to go on for well over 1 hour. It sends out a clear message that this is permissible, this is acceptable. And every time you send that message out, Nigel, the mob is emboldened.
Yes, I mean, beaming images onto Parliament is actually illegal, as you say, unless there is permission for it. When it comes to that particular slogan you're referring to, there are different interpretations, but it was a slogan that was coined by the Palestinian Liberation Organization back in the 1960s and later adopted by Hamas. But I've spoken to Palestinian politicians on the West Bank about that very thing, and they have a different interpretation from the one about sweeping all Jews into the sea. What they're saying is what it stands for is how you link Gaza on one side of Israel with the West Bank on the other. That's from the River Jordan to the sea. So it does depend who you listen to and how then they take such things. So it's not a simple one for the police to actually deal with and say, right, that slogan is definitely anti-Semitic. It is anti-Semitic in certain circumstances and to certain people.
OK, Nigel Nelson, thank you for your input. And for those just joining us, you can see that lectern now being set up outside Downing Street. We're expecting the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, to come out within the next 10 minutes to issue a highly anticipated statement to the nation late on a Friday night. I'm still joined in our studio in Westminster by our political correspondent, Olivia Utley. Olivia, for people tuning in late on this Friday afternoon, maybe getting back from work or the school run, give us a recap of where we're at.
Well, Rishi Sunak is doing this surprise speech on the steps of Downing Street. It's been a long time since we've had a steps of Downing Street speech. We hear that it's not going to be Sunak calling a general election. That was the rumour at the beginning. Actually, what he's going to be doing is talking about the toxification of British politics over the last few weeks and months, culminating, of course, in the election of George Galloway in that Rochdale by-election last night. We have had a whole string of incidents ever since, really, October the 7th and the beginning of those pro-Palestine marches, which started in London and then spread around the UK. There are stories of MPs from all sides of the House being intimidated, being harangued in public, and in some cases there are 3 female MPs, for example, who are now having to have private security. Westminster has become a bit of a fire pit when we go outside. When I go outside at lunchtime, there are so often these really quite scary protests on the streets of Westminster, of London and of the UK as a whole. Rishi Sunak has already spoken about this issue. He said that the mobs are taking over the street, but what we're expecting tonight is for him to put some sort of action, some sort of pledge behind those words. As lots of people have commented already, it's all very well saying that the mobs are ruling the streets, but his party has been in power for 13 years. He's been Prime Minister for a year and a half. What is he planning to do about it? Will he announce some sort of new law? Will he remind the police again of the powers that they have to enforce laws which are already there? What is he going to say? Well, we don't have very long to wait at all now.
Superb, Olivia. OK, so a glass of water has been set on that lectern there outside Downing Street. That surely means Rishi Sunak is imminent. But before that, let's quickly cross now to Michelle Dewberry, who joins us, of course, Jubes and Co. coming up 6 till 7. Straight after this, no doubt, we'll have the full analysis of what we're expecting and this highly anticipated statement from the Prime Minister. Jubes, what's on your menu?
So, of course, we will have the absolute latest on this Rishi Sunak speech. We'll be picking up the second that he finishes. Christopher Hope will be looking at that with me. Also, as well, I'll be talking to Ian Duncan-Smith. I want to talk to Mike Freer as well, of course, the MP that said that he won't run again because of intimidation. And also, as well, we can see on that crest there, on that lectern, I think now it's looking pretty clear that we are not expecting an announcement about the election. Yeah, I've got Professor Matt Goodwin keeping me company tonight, Ella Whelan, so we'll be dissecting all of it.
Michelle Dewberry, that is an excellent panel. Ian Duncan-Smith, a respected parliamentarian. Mike Freer, of course, who's been forced out of politics dramatically after his office was firebombed. A parliamentarian in a Jewish part of London. A parliamentarian forced to wear a stab vest to work because of a suspected murder attempt. The same terrorist that killed MP David Amos was waiting at Mike Freer's office. He only missed that encounter with this psychopathic terrorist because he was called into a meeting, I believe, with Boris Johnson. That was enough for him. He decided to call time, and who can blame him? Who can blame people for wanting to get out of this game when it's become so toxic? And it's getting to the point where parliamentarians are losing their lives in fear of their lives. Of course, that also happened to Joe Cox up in Batley. And we're seeing this now, this toxic nature spiralling out of control. As we said, the by-election last night in Rochdale fought on that single issue of Gaza. Astonishing when you think that's over 2,000 miles away from the northern town. Let's go back now to our political editor, Chris Hope at Downing Street. Chris, welcome back. The lectern's out, the water is out, the nation is watching. Chris, what are we expecting?
Well, set your watches. We're seeing behind me, Martin, the crest on the famous lectern. That means it's a government announcement rather than a party announcement. That means no general election. So everyone calm down. Don't worry about that. There's no election on May the 2nd being called right now, although there may be one in the future, but not now. It's not an election announcement. It's going to be an announcement about something else. We think maybe linked to MP security. I think the whole tone of the past 2 weeks has seen Rishi Sunak getting more and more concerned about the effect on our democracy, of the pressure, the intimidation by protesters. We saw it last week with the vote on Gaza when the Speaker of the House of Commons allowed MPs to vote on their measure to take the heat off them locally. We saw this week the PM calling police chiefs announcing £31 million of money spent on keeping candidates and MPs and councillors safe. That's a hotline. Extra support for private security. If you go around someone's house and you protest there, that'll be intimidation, etc. So we're hearing some testing taking place now by the speakers, which are above me. You'll hear it very shortly. So we are expecting the PM to emerge very shortly, and we expect some kind of announcement about public life, about intimidation, about safety of MPs, and it comes on the back of last night's dramatic win for George Galloway, the new MP for Rochdale. Of course, that was a very fractious, difficult, almost hugely controversial by-election, like which we haven't seen for many, many years, in which Labour disowned its own candidate. Another party did too. It was racked with issues about Gaza, as you said, Martin. A war being fought 2,000 miles away suddenly impacted a lot on a small town in Rochdale. Many people there, when I was up there earlier today, they were saying some were saying, well, great, we've got a new MP called George Galloway replacing Tony Wright, who died in January. Others saying, I don't know why George Galloway is here and why he's saying this is for Gaza. His first words as MP for Rochdale saying this is for Gaza, not for the people of Rochdale. The guy came second, the independent candidate. He was campaigning on hyper-local issues, a new hospital maternity wing for Rochdale FC, trying to keep that club afloat and ensure that it has a long future. Those are the issues that many care about in Rochdale, but for other people in the community, maybe the large Muslim population, George Galloway tapped into that and fought hard on the issue of Gaza, not an issue that would affect many other local people in Rochdale.
And Chris Hope, of course, we are the People's Channel. We're being absolutely flooded with GB views, comments from our listeners and viewers. I want to put a couple of those to you now, Chris. Caroline is saying this.
Please,
if Rishi Sunak just does his same old usual speech about how we shouldn't have to tolerate this or that, and no actual action is going to happen, or any effective change is implemented from the speech, then I'm going to be so very disappointed. Martin adds this: we don't want to hear any more promises or statements. We want action. Chris, people are frustrated with the rhetoric. They want to see firm action now.
I mean, Caroline should be reassured there is some measures the government's done. What happens in our public life is the MPs and governments propose and pass laws, and police then implement them. So there's a division between how the police choose to deal with trouble on the streets and the laws they've got, and whether MPs need more of them. Now, there are measures out there that are meant to deal with intimidation. You can't wear a mask on some marches. You can't beam offensive language onto public buildings like Parliament. The police are not enforcing that. I think that's the point of Wednesday night when the PM met with police chiefs across England and Wales. £31 million, a new protocol saying, making clear what police chiefs expect local forces to do, and that may affect some change. I think the PM is very aware that we are at the beginning of a long election year, a long run into what I expect, and I might be proved wrong, the November general election 2024, and that's why he wants to get the tone right, and that's why he's probably called this announcement. I've got to say to viewers and listeners of GB News, this is highly unusual. I mean, it's not what I was expecting to be doing, coming back from Rochdale, an overnight by-election, to be dashing here to number 10 and trying to communicate to viewers and listeners what is going on. He doesn't recall many of these. It's not a usual Sunak stunt. So whatever happens next will be dramatic. It'll be a line in the sand. I think it's going to be a tonal thing for Rishi Sunak. He wants to make very clear that we've gone so far, we've allowed our public life to be pressured, intimidated. It's at some point the fabric of democracy has got to be looked after. I think that's where we are with the Prime Minister, but we'll know very soon.
And another quick view here I want to read out to, well, everybody listening and also to you, Chris. Jeff adds this. I'm wondering if it's about the attitude that some demonstrators display on those very, very angry marches. All we ever needed to do was to have one law for all and no exceptions. Chris, that's a valid point. People are watching this week by week by week, and they are seeing what they believe now to be an emergence of two-tier policing. Okay. And there we have Rishi Sunak is coming out. He's emerged from the door at Downing Street. He's about to give a speech. Here it is. Let's go back to Rishi Sunak.
Weeks and months, we have seen a shocking increase in extremist disruption and criminality. What started as protests on our street has descended into intimidation, threats, and planned acts of violence. Jewish children fearful to wear their school uniform lest it reveal their identity. Muslim women abused in the street for the actions of a terrorist group they have no connection with. Now our democracy itself is a target. Council meetings and local events have been stormed. MPs do not feel safe in their homes. Long-standing parliamentary conventions have been upended because of safety concerns. And it is beyond alarming that last night the Rochdale by-election returned a candidate who dismisses the horror of what happened on October the 7th, who glorifies Hezbollah and is endorsed by Nick Griffin, the racist former leader of the BNP. I need to speak to you all this evening because this situation has gone on long enough and demands a response not just from government, but from all of us. Britain is a patriotic, liberal, democratic society with a proud past and a bright future. We're a reasonable country and a decent people. Our story is one of progress, of great achievements and enduring values. Immigrants who have come here have integrated and contributed. They have helped write the latest chapter in our island story. They have done this without being required to give up their identity. You can be a practicing Hindu and a proud Briton as I am, or a devout Muslim and a patriotic citizen as so many are, or a committed Jewish person and the heart of your local community, and all underpinned by the tolerance of our established Christian church. We are a country where we love our neighbours and we are building Britain together. But I fear that our great achievement in building the world's most successful multi-ethnic, multi-faith democracy is being deliberately undermined. There are forces here at home trying to tear us apart. Since October the 7th, there have been those trying to take advantage of the very human angst that we all feel about the terrible suffering that war brings to the innocent, to women and children, to advance a divisive, hateful ideological agenda. On too many occasions recently, our streets have been hijacked by small groups who are hostile to our values and have no respect for our democratic traditions. Membership of our society is contingent on some simple things: that you abide by the rule of law, and that change can only come through the peaceful democratic process. Threats of violence and intimidation are alien to our way of doing things. They must be resisted at all times. Nearly everyone in Britain supports these basic values, but there are small and vocal hostile groups who do not. Islamist extremists and the far right feed off and embolden each other. They are equally desperate to pretend that their violence is somehow justified, when actually these groups are two sides of the same extremist coin. Neither group accept that change in our country can only come through the peaceful democratic process. Both loathe the pluralist modern country we are. Both want to set Britain against Britain, to weaponize the evils of anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred for their own ends. The faith of Islam, peacefully practiced by millions of our fellow citizens, is emphatically not the same thing as the extremist political ideology of Islamism, which aims to separate Muslims from the rest of society. Islamist extremists and far-right groups are spreading a poison. That poison is extremism. It aims to drain us of our confidence in ourselves as a people and in our shared future. They want us to doubt ourselves, to doubt each other, to doubt our country's history and achievements. They want us to accept a moral equivalence between Britain and some of the most despicable regimes in the world. They want us to believe that our country, and the West more generally, is solely responsible for the world's ills, and that we, along with our allies, are the problem. In short, they want to destroy our confidence and hope. We must not allow that to happen. When these groups claim that Britain is and has been on the wrong side of history, we should reject it and reject it again. No country is perfect, but I am enormously proud of the good that our country has done. Our place in history is defined by the sacrifices our people have made in the service of their own freedom and that of others. And when these groups tell our children that they cannot and will not succeed because of who they are, when they tell children that the system is rigged against them or that Britain is a racist country, this is not only a lie, but a cynical attempt to crush young dreams and turn impressionistic minds against their own society. I stand here as our country's first non-white Prime Minister, leading the most diverse government in our country's history, to tell people of all races, all faiths and all backgrounds, it is not the colour of your skin, the God you believe in, or where you were born that will determine your success, but just your own hard work and endeavour. And we must be prepared to stand up for our shared values in all circumstances, no matter how difficult. And I respect that the police have a tough job in policing the protests we have seen and that they are operationally independent. But we must draw a line. Yes, you can march and protest with passion. You can demand the protection of civilian life. But no, you cannot call for violent jihad. There is no context in which it can be acceptable to beam anti-Semitic tropes onto Big Ben in the middle of a vote on Israel-Gaza. And there can be no cause that you can use to justify the support of a prescribed terrorist group like Hamas. And yes, you can freely criticize the actions of this government, or indeed any government. That is a fundamental democratic right. But no, you cannot use that as an excuse to call for the eradication of a state or any kind of hatred or anti-Semitism. This week, I've met with senior police officers and made clear it is the public's expectation that they will not merely manage these protests, but police them. And I say this to the police: we will back you when you take action. But if we are asking more of the police, we in government must also back up that call with action. To that end, this month the government will implement a new, robust framework for how it deals with this issue, to ensure that we are dealing with the root causes of this problem, and that no extremist organisations or individuals are being lent legitimacy by their actions and interactions with central government. You cannot be part of our civic life if your agenda is to tear it down. We will redouble our support for the Prevent programme to stop young minds being poisoned by extremism. We will demand that universities stop extremist activity on campus. We will also act to prevent people entering this country whose aim is to undermine its values. The Home Secretary has instructed that if those here on visas choose to spew hate or protest or seek to intimidate people, we will remove their right to be here. And our Britain must not be a country in which we descend into polarised camps, with some communities living parallel lives. It is not enough to live side by side. We must live together, united by shared values and a shared commitment to this country. And I want to speak directly to those who choose to continue to protest. Don't let the extremists hijack your marches. You have a chance in the coming weeks to show that you can protest decently, peacefully, and with empathy for your fellow citizens. Let us prove these extremists wrong and show them that even when we disagree, we will never be disunited from our common values of decency and respect. I love this country. My family and I owe it so much. The time has now come for us all to stand together to combat the forces of division and beat this poison. We must face down the extremists who would tear us apart. There must be leadership, not pandering or appeasement. When they tell their lies, we will tell the truth. When they try and sap our confidence, we will redouble our efforts. And when they try and make us doubt each other, we will dig deeper for that extra ounce of compassion and empathy that they want us to believe doesn't exist, but that I know does. If we do that, we can build on our great achievement in creating today's Britain, a country of kind, decent, tolerant people. We can make this a country in which we all feel a renewed sense of pride. This is our home. So let us go forward together, confident in our values and confident in our future.
Okay, that was the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, there delivering a statement to the nation live from Downing Street, talking about they want to destroy our confidence and hope we should reject them. Of course, this is since the marches from October the 7th onwards. Britain is not a racist country. These claims aim to tear us apart with law and order in mind. He said, I accept police have a tough job, but they must draw a line. He particularly said there is no situation where projecting anti-Semitic images onto Big Ben is acceptable, except, of course, that did happen and the police didn't intervene. When it comes to what happens next, because there was a lot of rhetoric in that speech, I felt, in terms of a new, robust framework to deal with the root causes. Let's cross back now to Downing Street, where Christopher Hope, our political editor, is still there. Chris, an impassioned speech, a lot of rhetoric. What about the action?
Well, Martin, as I would be saying there, a line in the sand has been drawn after a pretty grim 2 or 3 weeks in our democracy. He was quite tough there on George Galloway, saying that he described the by-election in Rochdale as beyond alarming. It's gone on for long enough. A line in the sand has been drawn. I heard a few things, though, which were newsy and things happening. He's going to double the amount of money being spent on the Prevent strategy, which is basically money spent on community engagement, stopping communities getting polarised, bringing them together. That's money spent by the combined with the Home Office and also the Levelling Up Department. That's normally where that money comes from. And also, he make very clear that he now expects police to enforce the law on the marches. What he's saying there, Martin, is what you saw last Wednesday: the police not enforcing that protest outside Parliament on the same day as MPs were debating the Gaza war. That will not happen again, and you will have the support of politicians. That's a really important thing for police. They now know what is expected of them, and we should be seeing that very shortly at the next marches that take place on the issue of the Gaza war. But the language, I've never heard the PM speak so emotionally, I think, about the language. We must build a home and go forward together, he said. He wants leadership is not pandering. You can't appease these communities. Islamists are not the same as people from the Muslim Islamic faith. They are different and have to be seen as such. In the same way, the far right should be taken on properly. He's saying he's drawing that line which maybe some politicians have not drawn between Islamism and people of a Muslim faith, and that's very important to him. He sees that. He wants to bring people together. He wants to recognise that the marches, the protests since October the 7th last year have sought to drive communities apart, and that stops. It's a line in the sand. He's saying, judge me by my actions. Well, let's see how it goes.
He mentions Islamism. It aims to split peaceful Muslims apart. That's exactly what we were saying on the show last week. But of course, Leanne was suspended for that. In terms of the actual action, a new robust framework to deal with the root cause. You mentioned doubling support to Prevent. Also, demanded universities stop peddling hate. So that means the government will be intervening perhaps in what's talked about on campuses. And also, interestingly, in relation to what happened in France, where we saw a foreign national deported after condemning the French flag, Chris Hope, Rishi Sunak said that Britain will remove the right of hateful preachers from abroad who spew hate. He's talking about deporting people in a similar way to France. At long last, that's firm action.
That happens, we know, don't we? And the government's very clear on the issue. When lawyers get involved in human rights, if human rights are invoked and these people can frustrate the will of the politicians, that's what we've seen so much. But I think he really has stepped up his game, the Prime Minister here. He's gone to the steps of Downing Street. He's made it very clear it's almost not really a party political matter, is it? It's one about our entire democracy. It'll be very interesting to see what Sir Keir Starmer says later. Normally, Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, the opposition leader, will respond somehow to what the PM has said, so we'll look forward to hearing from him later. But clearly the governments feel that last night's vote in Rochdale was the final straw. They've got to try and move in and make clear that people who undermine democracy, who try and divide our society, should be called out for what they are. The police should step in if that is illegal. And I think what we saw last week outside Parliament, we saw the offensive words about Israel and the Jewish communities portrayed onto Elizabeth Tower, where Big Ben is housed. That won't happen again. A line has been drawn in the sand here by the Prime Minister here in Downing Street.
OK, Chris Hope, Rishi Sunak saying we must face down the extremists. And with that, I'm going to hand over now seamlessly to Michelle Dewberry. Jubes & Co, picking up where I left off. Thank you very much.
I love that. That's one of the least seamless handovers I think I've ever had in all of my life. Speaking of extremists, let's hand over to Jubes & Co. Thank you very much for that, Martin Daubney. Well, yes, there is never a dull moment in British politics, is there? Of course, today is absolutely no exception. Where, everybody, do we even begin? Of course, we've seen the absolute whirlwind that happened in Rochdale last night with George Galloway. He has been issuing some stern warnings to Keir Starmer, so I want to look at that. I want to look at Rochdale. What does Galloway's success mean? We'll get into all of that.